In real life, some of us are here in a beautiful warehouse at the annex in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan, in something close to a sort of sitcom setup or like SNL, sort of like with an audience. I see Adam Miller, Tom Moran, Gina Raycard. Hello, welcome. Welcome to everyone joining us on the internet. We'll be live streaming on Twitch. A link to the live stream and schedule for yesterday's start and today and the rest of today can be found at the postcommodities.com website. The event is organized by Topman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, with the support of Arts Engine, Arts Initiative, Beta Matter Lab, and the School of Environmental Studies. I'm most thankful for my truly dreamy team that helped design and build and run this event over here to the left. Yeah, round of applause for them. Big feels for these people. Anna Tang, Ishan Paul, Leah Wolfman, Delaney McCraney, Gina Laudato, and Ray Majewski. Special thanks to Katie Cole for your patience and Bill Manspeaker for all your help. And to Detroit Bureau of Sound for lending us your beautiful, complex sounds. We're also very excited to announce that this kind of whole post-commodities world will be soon turned into a video game with Leah Wolfman, which will incorporate the contents from the sort of last 2 days, in addition to the kind of work of several guests who could not join us due to sort of schedule difficulties, and will be released later this fall. We've invited some what I consider soon-worthy people to join us yesterday and today. Today specifically, we'll be hearing from 4 of these presenters, and we will end on a keynote from Jack Halberson, followed by a discussion panel and Q&A with the day's presenters, with all of the day's presenters, moderated by Meredith Miller. Thank you, Meredith. Yeah. So make yourselves comfortable, grab a snack. It's a day. It's a day. Students and faculty present here, please prepare your questions. Anna will come around, and Gina as well will come around, pass you a mic. You can also step into one of our green screen booths if you so desire, enter the post-commodities world. It looks cute on many, so yeah, try to wear it. Those joining us online can submit questions over Twitch, and it takes a Twitch membership to submit a question. So if you want to, you can also just direct message me at Stocka Studio on Instagram, if that's easier. A badly bent steel handrail, a dated teal fridge, a shredded USB cord that lasted me a week, 30 windows from an office building demo, the scuffed side table you threw away last time you moved. Some of these items are likely still floating around the world, and that fact haunts me. We've made way too much stuff. The current production model of more, faster, cheaper, tied with the current consumption model, which puts spam in your inbox, junk in your mailbox, and makes what is cultured today, product tomorrow, and trash the day after, has filled up all drawers and landfills alike. We're overstuffed, yet there's items in the cart. There's a counterproductive muchness that is contributing to both social inequity and climate crisis. Design and architecture parallel this socio-material circumstances, this material entanglements where a new downstairs bathroom Pinterest folder is directly linked to sales of tiles. Temporary hypes can affect extraction demands in a quarry halfway around the world, and for the sake of a cool curve, we cut and smash together all these materials with little plan for their afterlife or their disaggregation. From material extraction to distribution to demolition, architecture is indeed implicated at all scales of our material saturation. Post-commodities, architecture after stuff, begins from this moment of material reckoning, arguing that to design in sync with this now times is to use resources that perhaps no longer come from the ground, but from the muchness around us, extracting value from that which we have already built. To design in sync with this now times is to understand that the material world can work through multipliers, where a thing times many, or a thing times often, or a thing times everywhere is of architectural concern. And through this logic, the geopolitical can actually found in a single bolt. It is to value reversibility in place of incrementalism. It is to know that building, as we do now, it is more destructive than it is creative at times. And it is to know that our material responsibility starts before we design and does not end when we are done designing. And ultimately, it is also to acknowledge that frictionlessness and convenience were always fictions, and post-commodity will be quite a bit of work. And I know, it's another post. We're all post talking about post. But post here is meant to mark not the end, but the sort of start of another, again, sort of new way of doing things. Not to stop us from design, but rather the opposite, to place some urgency behind the lots of work we need to do to kind of turn this around. So the symposium foregrounds what I consider are designers and thinkers who explore the possibilities of architecture participation in a kinder socio-material ecology through tactics and material ingenuities needed for a more future-minded and non-extractive material culture, or those that help us visualize the consequences of our ways. Setting up a couple questions. What is it about stuff anyway? And what can architecture do with all the material after this kind of era of materialism? Our first presenter of the day will be the Institute for Post-Natural Studies. The Institute for Post-Natural Studies is a center for artistic experimentation from which to explore and problematize the post-natural as a framework for contemporary creation. Founded in 2020, the Institute is a platform for critical thinking, a network that brings together artists and researchers concerned about the issues of the global ecological crisis through experimental formats, sharing and producing open knowledge. With that, we welcome Institute for Post-Natural Studies.
So, hello everyone. We are part of the Institute for Postnatural Studies. My name is Gabriel Alonso.
I am Pablo Ferreira.
And we are super happy to be joining you. Thank you for having us, and thank you for organizing this amazing event. We are very happy to be part of it. And congratulations on all this setting. It's quite amazing to see us in this digital world, living there and sharing space with you all. We are speaking from Madrid, Spain. We, as Laida said, we are a pretty recent platform called the Institute for Postnatural Studies, founded in 2020 here in Madrid. And we started as a collective kind of group of people interested in redrawing and rethinking our relation towards nature. So we believe that we have to really change the way we approach nature and understand it as a cultural construct. So one of our main purposes is to, through different formats, try to rethink and imagine new ways of understanding our relation with the planet. We do this through various different activities, experiments, platforms. We have seminars, online seminars with amazing thinkers. We are running some open calls for residencies in our space in Madrid, and we are now installing an exhibition in a museum that puts together all our recent research. So what we wanted to share today, because we think all the post-commodities issue, and we are part of this post-natural, post-commodities, and we understand it the same way that Laida was saying, no? Like, we understand post as something that we have to rethink and to start again, no? So our post-natural is a new beginning in which we have to rethink what materialities, what ecologies, what effects we have to design and project for making better worlds, actually. And we think art is a very special discipline, a very special place from where to think. But we also understand design as a very important practice that has to really change its coordinates, change its ways of operating. And what we are going to share today is a research that we did 6 months ago or something like that, that we presented in the University of Bologna in Italy. And it deals with this idea of design as a very important practice that can show us some things that we have been doing maybe wrong, and some things that we could maybe do better. And one of the things we have been interested in is how to think on design as a non-anthropocentric discipline, how to put the human out from the center of the picture and out from the center of design, and mainly every practice. No? So we are very interested from the Institute in trying to think from a non-anthropocentric perspective. For us, this is something that we are investigating from many different perspectives. So now we're gonna show you a video, 10-minute video with all this research about an issue that we think is very urgent nowadays, that is sterilization, and the way design has created a boundary between life and death, between micron and micro. And Pablo will tell you more about the research after we play the video. So hope you enjoy it, and thanks for being there.
Back in the 19th century, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, making use of the technological developments of their time, made microbes visible for the first time to the human eye. Visualizing these tiny companions led to a determinant shift in our perception of health and disease. As pathogens were found to be the direct cause of certain diseases, we realized that by changing the environment where these microbes lived, we could influence our health. This is precisely where design, in a complex and multiple way, comes in. In the colonies overseas and in hand with the hygienist movement sweeping throughout Europe, the design of spaces came to be considered a form of preventive medicine. Domestic spaces in particular became the battlefield where the war against microbes was waged, as the 1884 London Health Exhibition shows. In this short presentation, we want to trace the relations between hygiene, microbes, and domestic design through the concept of sterilization. By sterilization, we mean not only the physical act itself, but the set of practices and the collective imaginaries that feed on it. We believe that looking through the lens of sterilization is urgent and important, as it implies a shift from a one-sided anthropocentric concern with human health to a post-natural perspective, which brings the relationships between species to the fore. We propose looking to contemporary philosophers and scientists women such as Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, and Lynn Margulis, who can help us to stop perceiving microorganisms as a threat and instead see them as our allies for new interdisciplinary practices of co-design. We believe this is now more important than ever, as today we are forced to recognize the ways in which we live entangled with other species. Only by understanding these entanglements, making them the basis of design practices, will we be able to move beyond obsolete temporary patches to real solutions for an interspecies future. Between the years of 1860 and 1864, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were able to demonstrate the causal relation between germs and disease. To do this, they relied on the sterilized environment for excellence, the laboratory. At that time, disease control became crucial to make the European colonial enterprise profitable, turning the colony's territory into a life-size laboratory that Pasteur and his colleagues could use. As Latour states, malaria or yellow fever were to be destroyed not with vaccines, but by ordering the colonists and natives to build their houses differently. In this way, sterilization became a biopolitical project for designing systems of spatial and social control, which was inextricably linked to the economical and political interests of colonial powers. At the same time, in Europe, sterilization became central to spatial design, fostered by the hygienist movement. This growing concern around hygienic spaces responded as much to scientific research as it did to vague concepts like contagion, miasma, or dirt, and discourses around race, gender, and sexuality which were present in society. The London Health Exhibition of 1884, among whose attendees was Pasteur himself, was the pinnacle of this discourse, gathering in one place the multiplicity of devices and practices that emerged around the concept of sterilization. Designs for the home had a prevalent place in the exhibition, which became a kind of hygienist IKEA of the 19th century, where middle-class families walked around the aisles looking for gadgets to ensure the cleanliness and purity of their households. Furniture was lifted from the ground, ornaments faded, and fairy masks were turned into sleek and smooth surfaces. Today, the biopolitical project of sterilization has become so widespread and refined that we have become blind not only to the presence of our microbial companions, but also to the strategies that have permitted and continue to allow their invisibilization. The Victorian obsession with pristine homes has been perfected, taking design and architecture strategies to the point of creating quasi-medical buildings. Think, for example, of the plastic gaskets or the rubber, which we invariably use for sealing pipes and windows in our houses, a material which incidentally was used in Pasteur's time for the design of surgical gloves. Responding to the omnipresent, invisible threat of undesirable microorganisms, rubber has also abandoned the operating room, evolving into invisible and omnipresent joints that seal our houses, giving us the false impression that we can live and act separately from other organisms. Rubber, as many others, becomes a facilitator of the biopolitical project of sterilization. We have entered what Richard Sennett calls the politics of indifference, in which microbes remain outside our daily concerns and consequently outside daily practices. However, we believe that the current situation is forcing us to reassess the ways in which microorganisms and design have interacted. Since the times of Pasteur, microbes have been considered within architecture and design only as pathogens, and the forms, materials, and technologies have been developed in order to eliminate anything microbial through non-selective methods. The narrative of sterilization classifies bodies and spaces in a series of dichotomies, such as inside, outside, pure, contaminated, wild, domesticated, which become both ontological and physical borders. These borders allow inside only those living organisms that we consider companion species, such as our pets, dogs, cats, fishes, and the like, certain species of plants, and of course other humans. Paraphrasing Anna Singh, architectural spaces, and in particular the home, put a cordon sanitaire which impedes inter- and interspecies love. Today, and in order to face the current crisis, we must overcome this unloving binary heritage of design. To do this, we propose to look at microbes through a different microscope. Lynn Margulis' research into the symbiotic origins of the eukaryotic cell was fundamental in changing our understanding of microbes. Margulis, who is particularly fond of bacteria, depicts a world where microorganisms are no longer dangerous, minuscule enemies, but are fundamental symbionts. She claims that most bacteria have far more important things to do on this earth than to devour our tissues while we're still alive, drink our blood when we are old and weak, or fight with us over who will eat our food first. According to her, it is the notorious self-centeredness of our species that leads to the manic claim that all bacteria are killers to be eradicated from our lives. So it turns out that even our seemingly hermetic homes are seething with microbial life, and what's more, so are our bodies. The simplified and biased perception of microbes as nemesis that we inherited from the 19th century no longer holds, and the very subject of design is now not a self-contained individual, but a walking assemblage of different kinds of organisms. Design should profit from these new scientific insights and incorporate microbes as valuable allies who, since they are neither inside nor outside, function as a continuum between organisms and the environment. In fact, design is already doing so, as cavities which were previously sealed and filled with rubber are now left open for microorganisms to proliferate. In the words of Donna Haraway, it is in the tunnels, caves, remnants, edges, and crevices where the symbiogenetic and symbiotic earthly ones make a living. Consciously interacting with microbes in the process of design must also mean coming to terms with the unpredictable, so that research into new forms and materials must not consist so much in final human configurations, but rather in unexpected collaborations between forms of life. Designing in symbiotic times can also mean looking at mycelium growing over strips of wood, or algae proliferating inside foam structures. Bioreceptive architecture and materials, probiotic design, research into the use of biomaterials, including mycelium, bioluminescent bacteria, or photosynthetic garments, or the profiling of the home microbiome are all examples of these new aesthetics, moving away from purity and cleanliness to more three-dimensional, complex, and colorful patterning. Just as Margaret McFadden says that human bodies can no longer be seen as fortresses to defend against microbial onslaught, but must be re-envisioned as nested ecosystems, so neither buildings can continue to be constructed as impenetrable strongholds. The unpredictable, the unstable, and the permeable, which characterize symbiotic forms of microbial living, should stop being suppressed in design to become opportunities for moving beyond anthropocentric conceptions of inert spaces. As Donna Haraway puts it, truly nothing is sterile, and that reality is a terrific danger, basic fact of life, and creator-making opportunity. The challenge that humans are facing today is not altogether that different from the one experienced at the time of Pasteur, and there is a risk that design will respond with the same solutions. An alternative landscape of initiatives is growing, which seems to have realized that contemporary spaces have to become ecosystems that host life rather than sterilized borders. These new strategies also have to contribute to the redefinition of domestic spaces, which now have gained such a new relevance. We believe design can be a privileged space to experiment these encounters between species and to bring a different awareness about the ways in which we live entangled with each other. Now that everyone's attention has been turned to the microscale, we'd like to invite designers to keep looking at our microscopic companions as a way of dissolving established borders in design and speculating and imagining all the possible futures.
So, well, thank you for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As Gabriel said, this video is part of an ongoing investigation that started as actually well, it was just we saw the opportunity to participate on a symposium at the University of Bologna, who was asking for papers and lines of investigation dealing with how to de-anthropocize or place the human out of design as a critical platform, a critical tool. So from a really, really simple idea that we had, which had to deal with our basic notion of design, which had to, well, we were looking at white surfaces and really clean and sleek design as it is today. We started thinking on how did we ever get to that clean and that pristine idea, that pristine aesthetic of design. And all of a sudden that aesthetic took us to dive deep into a really, really long line of connections, starting with let's say a wrong understanding of microorganisms, starting with Kolb and Pasteur. So all of a sudden we found ourselves that from design and from questioning the basic notion of design that we have today, as questioning something as simple as aesthetic, we were uncovering and developing a really interesting and a really up-to-date, really contemporary line of investigation. This video is, let's say, the result or the way we use to present the paper. So as Gabriel said, we are a experimental platform, or we experiment with different formats to present our lens of investigation. So using a video to present academic paper has been a great success for us. As well, as you might have seen, design takes a major role in how we share our ideas, and taking this paper into this video that we have developed with our graphic designer, it's itself a design piece, or well, a multi-format experimental piece. Then to continue with this line of investigation, and I wanted to, well, just to share with you how this line has taken us to a non-human design. Following this post-commodity, and as you might have understanding, as you might have heard through the video, the whole idea of living with other species together, it's still certainly uncomfortable for us. We are still looking for really still houses. We are still looking to see all those crevices, and what the idea of us living with other species is opening a whole new perspective into what we call non-human design, which is something that we are working on. We have been giving several classes and workshops as Wang, and we are understanding non-human design as well, just another approach, just another step towards displacing humans out of the center of the practice of design, in order to achieve a new ecology that will be prosperous and will be well, a correct ecology for the nature that we are dealing with today. So for the video, that's a quick recap. We found, well, we have, if you would like to look at all the all the references of the video, we have been reading some really important lecturers and writers, thinkers, philosophers, and for us, I would say, like, a way to summarize this video, or what we want to say with the video, is we already look at Pasteur and Robert Koch in order to achieve this kind of design that was needed at a certain time. We have other heads, other minds, as Lee Margulies, and we propose focusing on their work, on these amazing philosophers / scientists that can teach us a lot about how to deal with this interspecies future that we ought to live close to. So that's
and we also think now, when I was in the video again, that this topic is quite urgent, of course, after the pandemic and after what is happening, no, and this idea of so much stuff around us and so many things, and how design and architecture have to rethink themselves in order to create safe spaces and healthy spaces, we think we have to look back and rethink our relation towards these microorganisms and the life that is surrounding us, but that we cannot see. No? Because one of the problems that we see today is that if we try to create boundaries, we won't coexist. So if we understand design as boundaries, so when the pandemic started, you might remember having lots of plastic boundaries no, around us. And we think this is not understanding the complexities of the world that we are inhabiting today. So all the crises that we're facing today, I think we have to really change the scope and start thinking of not only of design of what we see, but also of the invisible, no? Of all these invisible creatures and invisible living species that surround us. So with this, I think we are finishing. We will join you for the questions and
for the panel
discussion later. And we're super happy to be here. We will love to share more thoughts and questions after. And thanks for watching and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Institute. Next up, I have the pleasure of introducing Jaffer Kolb, who's joining us as half of New Affiliates, a New York-based design practice that he co-leads with Evie Diamantopoulos. In addition to a range of award-winning build work, their practice looks to initiate projects and collaborations that focus on matters of reuse within a context of material excess, particularly as it relates to current standards of practice. For this work, they have collaborated with various branches of the New York City government, including the Departments of Sanitation and Parks and Recreation. Welcome, Jaffer.
Hi. I'm having a kind of moment where I can't tell what I look like in your amazing world building format, Laida. It's like a reverse Lacanian moment for me. Hi, everyone. First off, thank you so much for the invitation, Laida, and to University of Michigan. It's actually exciting for me to be sort of presenting work in the context of this symposium, just because I think a lot of the issues that seem particularly exciting to me came about through my fellowship at Michigan now 6-7 years ago, and it feels like a nice place to be back. Wish I could be in person, but I love the kind of space that you've made here. So thanks for the invitation. I'm going to go a slightly more conventional route and present a few ongoing projects that explore some of the issues that have come up maybe around the work that got us invited here. So we're calling this talk Time After Time. This is an image on the left of my partner, Evie Diamantopoulos, in a drywall gypsum recycling plant in Pennsylvania. And on the right, obviously, a kind of composite few images by our old colonialist friend, Caspar David Friedrich. So when Laida first reached out about the symposium, I was thinking about their prompt and kept getting stuck on the idea of the after in their subtitle, architecture after stuff. Starting a practice in New York gives one a kind of immediate sense of guilt and anxiety around this idea of stuff. We've written about it, we panic about it all the time. Your first projects are likely small renovations, apartments, and in our case, exhibitions, all of which produce this kind of image of new materials that are carted in and out of buildings, of institutions week after week and month after month. The stuff starts to nag at your ethical self and it starts to cloud your vision. Soon it's sort of all you can see. And you become aware of and even obsessed with this idea of time. So we tend to think a lot about time. Here we go. About sort of life and death in buildings, about building and unbuilding, about past and future. It occupies us, and even maybe before we were explicitly working as a kind of pair. These are two projects that we worked on very early on, actually before starting New Affiliates, both of which kind of dealt with time. The first one had a lot to do actually with commodification, the super title of this symposium. But it was kind of hybridization of thinking through commodification and time. So in this case, it came about of an observation. This was done in 2014-15, so a while back before the kind of absolute proliferation of sharing apps, but kind of at the beginning of when you could start to see them accelerating in their kind of distribution. So we were noticing, along with 4 other collaborators, that the idea of space was becoming less material and more kind of imaginary and delineated. And this idea of renting space, from Airbnb through Craigslist, through all of these different apps that came after, suddenly we started to notice that space was getting carved up more and more and sublet or let at increasingly small time increments. So the idea of renting a room or even a bed, we tried to accelerate that and basically made an app called Share, where you could share just about anything, and you could actually go into public space and start kind of claiming that for yourself, and also establish the kind of time increments around which one might occupy discrete spaces. This felt early on like a kind of way of rejecting the materialism of architecture and actually embracing the idea of space being something that could be defined and produced and then temporalized. This will come back a little bit later on in the presentation. The second very quick sort of installation project from many years ago that kind of led us down this path of time was called Time Fears the Pyramids, done a year or 2 after Share. And in this one, we were sort of imagining a kind of end of time or being out of time. In this case, once again, the idea of kind of data and the visualization thereof being sort of an abstraction through which we could understand that after time ends, all we'll have is the kind of stuff and the waste and the image of stuff and the image of waste that we've built up in the last particularly 100, 200 years. And we created a kind of algorithm that would take any kind of data and turn it into these kind of strange pyramid forms that would then be expressed through the creation of images and sound waves and printouts and digital information. In other words, just to basically say, what do we do with all this stuff? Why don't we kind of like level it all out and then imagine a kind of post-apocalyptic machine that would forever just produce pyramids, which we saw as like the kind of Platonic object. In transitioning to practice, away from the idea of kind of speculative art making, we began thinking about value in time, to think about the kind of typical building process, to take known values and to kind of actually re-understand them and identify hidden value. The intersections of value and time felt very sort of evident to us, but also felt like an area that was ripe for kind of playing through design projects. And this diagram actually became really important to how we considered not only taking on new work, but actually initiating the work that Laida pointed out we've initiated with various branches of the city government. And our interest kind of transitioned here in the context of stuff towards away from time specifically, just as a kind of word, and more towards duration and durationality. And for us, this way of dealing with the idea of stuff comes down to duration. So at what timescales does architecture operate? Can we think instead of sort of more classically, program, for example, we think about just the use of time in space and how that can transform, essentially in order to kind of combat some of the problems that we were finding in the field. So I'm roughly dividing the rest of the presentation into 3 sections, looking at a short-term project, a medium-term project, and a long-term project. And hopefully we'll start to kind of interweave different ideas drawn from some of these early experiments and these early thoughts and these early anxieties, the early panic, which has never really quite subsided. So I'm going to start with the short term, and it's a project called roughly Museums Remodeled. This schedule is a sort of nerdy schedule that we made in working with an ongoing client, a museum in New York, where we noticed that shows were in installation and deinstall basically as often as they were being viewed. In other words, the kind of like metric of time in a museum is as much about creation and destruction as it is about simply being. And that felt really perverse to us for sort of obvious reasons. The museum is a space, so this is a plan of, in this case, the Jewish Museum. We work with a lot of sort of museums around the city. And this one we've had an ongoing collaboration with since we started. And we noticed, that within the kind of idea of the plan of the museum, this goes back to kind of like Wigley and the Vienna Secession building, that actually the museum is a space of constant transformation, and there are certain fixed parts of the museum and then certain dynamic parts of the museum. And of course, we were the sort of stewards of the dynamic parts, which sadly or tragically, were the parts that were producing the most amount of waste. So this is a bunch of our exhibition designs kind of overlaid on each other to show the kind of absolute flexibility of one part of the plan that we were constantly thinking through. And then of course, after every show, you end up with all of this waste. This is like not a particularly cool way of looking at things, but it's one that we kind of confront all the time. So just thinking about cataloging, the museum was actually a great partner in this. We thought they would be really annoyed by our sort of investigation into the way that they operate, simply because it's identifying a huge problem, but they were actually super open to it and identified the same issue on their end too. So we started over the course of a year, just kind of cataloging everything that kind of came in and out and looking at the actual material byproducts. And starting to think about the museum as a space, that kind of implies two forms of architecture: a kind of permanent envelope and a temporary insides, and the kind of frictions that work between them and the kind of pressures that work between them. In this case, we actually approached the Department of Sanitation with these initial, I don't even want to call them findings, observations, to see if they had any way through which we could think about reuse and kind of entering into their economy of material exchange. We began with these speculative renderings, sort of talking about how wall coverings could find second lives, going from the museum into, in this case, a sound studio by using acoustical foam, the idea of a vitrine starting in a museum and going to another institution after it's done being used, of flooring being donated from the museum into the kind of public realm. We got a little stuck on drywall, but I'll come back to that in a minute. But basically just a series of speculations. Through the Department of Sanitation, we basically did an investigatory exhibition design for the Jewish Museum. It was on all three floors of the museum for this show on Leonard Cohen a couple years ago. And basically our goal was to create an exhibition design that didn't sacrifice any of its kind of like performativity or the kind of design ideas that we had, but that could mostly be reused. And so we ended up using a series of techniques that we could basically upcycle after the show. It involved a lot of kind of custom detailing that would involve allowing surfaces and design elements to be installed and deinstalled easily. Obviously, this ended up costing more money for the museum, but as I said, they were like a really great client on this and able to work with us and give the kind of resources and money that we needed in order to make this happen. We also had a whole other series of concerns around sound engineering because this was 13 discrete sound installations in an early 20th, late 19th century mansion. So there was like an acoustical mess everywhere. We had to fill everything with foam, with rubber, with added insulation. And the great thing is that in the end, we were able to actually rehouse, I want to say like 80 to 90% of the material that we entered into the show without kind of sacrificing either form or performance, which to us felt really important because we didn't want this project to kind of fall under the category of things that are designed in order to look like they'll be reused. Just because, I mean, I think for the sake of the show, it was important to us that it had its own kind of autonomy. So again, just speculating on where these things could go. This was now in conversation with the Department of Sanitation. And this is a sort of catalog of the materials that were donated through their branch Donate NYC. So again, the rubber flooring was taken away. We used these beanbag seats, prefabricated sound panels, foam panels, vitrines, even the subflooring and the insulation in the ceiling tiles, all were basically taken away by the Department of Sanitation and rehoused after the fact. So that felt like a really nice and productive way of reusing everything. Laida kind of alluded to this in their great introduction to today's events about the sort of labor that it takes in order to do work like this, the calculations, the taxonomies, the cataloging, basically the consideration that involves excess work on our parts in order to do things more responsibly. So in this case, the idea of a post-occupancy drawing became really important so that we could actually know precisely the amount of usable material that could kind of re-enter the material economy and then leave the museum. And again, this was just interesting to us to start thinking through how we would work on it. The other part of this kind of short-term project, the experiment with the Jewish Museum led us down this other rabbit hole around gypsum recycling, the image that I started the talk with. We became obsessed with the kind of unreusability of sheetrock and of drywalls, in part from a kind of premise around material reuse and another, a kind of investigation on the ideology of the white cube. So, obviously art spaces are typically thought of as these white box galleries, which are supposedly ideologically neutral, but obviously are embedded with their own kind of material form, material economy, material ecology. The white cube is not a neutral space, either politically nor materially. And we were really interested in kind of poking holes in this kind of apparent fixation on whiteness within the art world. So we went and we visited with this gypsum recycling facility in Pennsylvania, talked to them a lot about how they reuse. And then we sort of embarked on this. It was a performance piece commissioned by the arts organization Performa in 2019, right before the pandemic. So we used a kind of material investigation to lead into a kind of performance around our observations on this one material. We went around in October of 2019 and basically took pieces of gallery walls that were going through deinstallation all over the city. And we just kind of picked them up in a truck, and we reconstituted them into a new kind of scarred white box, which to us kind of blended this like nice moment between a kind of new surfacing, or if we're being super optimistic, we could maybe call it an ornamental system, and one in which the kind of like traces of the materials were sort of left. Documentation in this process was really important. So every time we picked up a piece of drywall, we were very careful to draw it out sort of completely in order to kind of reconstitute it like a puzzle piece. This is a video which is very fast paced. But basically, we were super careful in order to kind of piece everything together as best we could. Obviously, we needed to rely on a plywood backing for everything because the pieces wouldn't fit nicely on 16-inch studs. But this was also donated to us by a museum that was going through deinstall. So everything got kind of reused. In the end, this was also, we're not professional wall builders, so it was like maybe a little bit rough. But we went through the entire process of what it would mean to kind of retreat this as a kind of reconstituted white cube gallery. We were careful to sort of leave certain things revealed, so there was almost like a 2.5D surfacing. But in the end, we kind of hung the show as though we were actually hanging a show of work. That kind of work that we did both with the Department of Sanitation, with Performa, through the kind of art world in the city, to us represented the kind of shortest term work that we could do on the topic of like what we do with all this stuff. The next scale is what I'm calling the medium term. And this is a project that we've been working on with the Department of Parks and Recreation in the city. And it came about through an observation that architects and the way that we design produces a lot of stuff. So we're not only, culpable or responsible for all this stuff of material and construction demolition, but also just the way we practice. And one of the things that struck us as really kind of crazy was the way that we build these sort of epic mock-ups for buildings that are under construction. Oftentimes these cost anywhere from like $100,000 to $300,000 to make. They're made out of the actual materials of the building. They're reviewed oftentimes just like kind of once for their visual qualities, and then they're thrown away. There are two kinds of mock-ups, both performance mock-ups, which tests, assembly systems that are sort of subject to a battery of violent tests, from wind tests to water tests to fire, to mob tests where groups of people just beat them up with sticks. Those are maybe a little bit less available to us because they tend to get a little bit roughed up. But visual mock-ups still are like this massive kind of source of production in our field, and one that we thought could sort of bear more investigation. We noticed a kind of curious resonance between the scale of the mock-up and the scale of these garden structures around the city. And this was done actually just through walking around the streets, wondering what we could do with these mock-ups, and noticing that they actually had this kind of parallel scale to garden sheds, greenhouses, casitas, places of social congregation, which in themselves have this great sort of history in the city of being made from salvaged materials. So we wanted to kind of extend that logic into a more sort of advanced planned public space proposal. So we approached the Department of Parks and Recreation, and they were super enthusiastic and paired up with us, and then started just telling us gardens that we could bring these mock-ups to. One of the things we found really interesting is that the map of development in the city, so the buildings for which these mock-ups are made, which tend to be the kind of like expensive, capital A architectured buildings are at an inverse map to the community gardens in the city. So, Midtown, the Brooklyn waterfront, Wall Street, these are not where the community gardens are. They tend to be in other places. So we thought of this as creating a kind of like dialogue between two sort of faces of the city, hinged on this idea of the mock-up itself. So the mock-up became a translation of the design process and development into a kind of urban bridge, linking the image of the growing city to the neighborhoods that are kind of outside of it, thus offering a kind of double view of a single material object. And again, like thinking through the idea of what we can do with stuff, like maybe it just takes a kind of double vision or a second look. We're doing a pilot project, which is actually about to go into foundations being poured after many years of frustrating delays. And we started with a building in Tribeca, a very expensive and high-end condo building. We were gifted a mock-up from the developer, which is 4 custom concrete panels that are kind of like very beautiful and material with this $30,000 window. And through the Parks Department, we found this garden in Edgemere, which is actually just south of JFK, which you can see just above and right near the Rockaways in the city. So the idea would be to take the mock-up from Tribeca into the Rockaways. The community garden is great. They're full of really enthusiastic gardeners. A lot of the work they do is based on education, and that became part of the program of the building that we wanted to use for the mock-up. This is a plan of the garden. The mock-up is this kind of diagonal piece you see at the number 1. Basically, the design is there's a big kind of shade structure roof canopy with 3 smaller structures underneath, which you see here. The mock-up you see on the right side of the image, translated again very directly from its Tribeca context into this kind of like new space. And all the materials that we use for the rest of the building proposal are, very inexpensive. They're all available at Home Depot. One of the things that we learned through conversations with the community gardens is that the gardeners is that they need to and like to be able to kind of append and fix and change their structures. So it all has to be materials that they can sort of like cut up, add to, replace things over time. So again, going back to the idea of duration and time scale, for us, there are certain elements to this project that are fixed, like the concrete foundation, like the mock-up, which is heavy and unwieldy. And then there are parts that are kind of free and flexible, accommodating another form of kind of time scale in this sort of material flow cycle that is of interest to us through the project. So on the left, you see a greenhouse. On the right, you see this kind of community room mock-up building sort of plopped in the middle of the garden. Here's a view from the street. So there's actually a view of the bay beyond. Actually, the Long Island Sound. You see this NYCHA housing on the left. And so the idea was that the structure was actually incredibly sort of open to the kind of community and public use as a series of occupiable spaces. We're building it now. And I originally thought of this actually as a kind of like freeze frame. This is a quick animation, which I probably don't have time for, but I originally thought of this in the context of the symposium as a kind of freeze frame, a frozen moment of development, but I actually realized that it really does occupy this medium scale of durational design, which is that it takes something that exists in the city that represents a moment in time, but it embeds it within a kind of community structure that can kind of adapt and change it on its own time cycle. And for us, this is really integral to the ways in which we think about how architecture can meet the kind of changing needs of society built around, whatever the post-commodity, or just the idea of things kind of coming in and out and accumulating and being wasted and thrown away. The way that we pitched this project, this is a really kind of silly animation that we made for the community gardeners to kind of like let them understand how everything is a kind of dynamic structure that needs to be moved, that needs to be accounted for, that needs to be kind of like planned into this eventual structure that they would receive. And here we kind of deliberately showed it as a kind of skeleton that they could transform as needed. So the last scale that I'll talk about in my remaining few minutes is what I'm calling the long term. And this is centered around a several-year research project for a structure that we're actually building for our family, for my family. And so it gets to sort of it gets out of the kind of like client bind, but it actually allows us to also experiment with it more. And it comes from a kind of study of pre-engineered building. So this is a project sort of loosely for this talk called the Sometimes Cabin, built on the idea of sort of like changeable infrastructure through a scale of time. It started actually with a talk that I gave that both Laida and Jack Halberson and a few others on this symposium were part of last year at SciArc called A Queer Query, where I, along with a collaborator, Adrian Silva, who's a student at Princeton, were really looking closely at queerness in the rural and this idea of homesteading, among many other topics related. And I just became really interested in the idea of homesteading as this thing that represents reuse, material accumulation, time, growth, etc., and starting to think really carefully about ways that we can build that are kind of immediate and short term, and how those might be attached to things that are kind of longer term. So very roughly kind of intermingling the idea of the DIY with the idea of the pre-engineered. So to create a kind of like static frame and then to create moments that could be added to. Obviously, this is very connected with the previous project I just showed, the testbeds project, where I think being able to work with things allows for kind of minimization of waste and a kind of more open and expansive consideration of the way that we reuse stuff. This partly came out of this idea, just spending a lot of time in the countryside, that actually material waste is minimized. This is totally anecdotal. I do not have evidence yet to back this up. But that actually, like, people sit on piles of stuff and they find ways to reuse them. Whereas in the city, I think because we all have so little space, things just like we have to get them out of our apartments as quickly as possible. We have to throw them on the curbside and get them picked up. It feels like a very different sort of ethos in the country, where you kind of keep things in order to use them. And the kind of general kind of landscape of waste feels a lot less proliferate. So this idea of the DIY and the pre-engineered, parallel with this idea of the changeable and the semi-fixed, we're looking at a whole range of kind of different references. What is like the kind of typical dwell style cabin versus things that are kind of permanent versus temporary. As you see in like the Chinati Foundation image, we became really fascinated by this one company, Worldwide Steel. They're responsible for like a massive amount of the steel barns that you see all over the kind of landscape. Won't go into this tangent, but part of it came from this observation that like architects are always bemoaning the kind of loss of architecture within the profession. So, where we once would be hired to design all of these kind of like barns and informal structures, now it's just far easier, cheaper, and faster to go online and order it like an IKEA kit, and it'll just arrive to you and you can put it together. But we still believe there's a kind of role for designers to kind of enter this conversation and create moments that can somehow do more than what those pre-engineered systems might offer. So starting to think through a kind of decoupling of structure versus skin, playing with how the form kind of like attaches itself to the steel frame. We started to think about the way that this could change the way a building is occupied. So, going from a kind of hyper rigid type of architecture that you see on the left to a kind of a loose assembly of objects in the middle to a kind of quasi open space on the right. So these steel frames in their kind of modularity offer totally different kind of forms, both of occupancy, but also in terms of the kind of permanency of the architecture that attaches itself to them. This also is sort of tied into the idea of program. But I think going back to what I was saying at the very beginning, program as sort of determined by duration, I think, in this case. So just a series of studies about cost, possible adaptability, trying to keep things as cheap as possible. The plan for the product that we're now building is shown here. So from left to right, you see a kind of like fixed series of rooms, followed by a big open plan area with kind of looser elements that can be more free floating, to the far right, which is a kind of semi-indoor, semi-outdoor space, which is totally open. So we're considering this a kind of structure in 3 speeds. So you get the kind of permanent concrete foundation, a long-term steel frame, a wood frame, which you see as medium term, and then roofing, which is kind of dependent. And then on top of all of it, we are attaching this kind of fabric tent structure, a sort of skin that can be constantly changing and totally transform both the form of the building itself, but also the way that it's programmed. So understanding these 3 speeds, like the kind of permanent / long-term, the medium term, and the short term, become a way of kind of elastically treating a kind of homesteading project that is adaptable and customizable over time. So again, the concrete and the steel frame we see as sort of slow or semi-permanent. This scale, I think, is the kind of most exciting because through a sort of like wood cabin balloon frame system, you can actually attach to the steel, and that's exactly the structure we're making now, and create a kind of completely changeable semi-permanent architecture. So maybe in 5 or 10 years, you can actually extend the steel frame beyond, how it exists in this moment. And then obviously the kind of fabric super skin that kind of sits over everything that can create this kind of liminal space between the outside and the inside is something that could change at the scale of a day or even an hour. This also implies a lot of different material assemblies and material acts. So thinking through how we infill this kind of steel timber framed space through hybrid structures feels very exciting in terms of kind of programming things over time. And this is the current state of construction on the project. It's ironically, given this talk, it's a little bit slow because of material availability and trying to keep things as inexpensive as possible. But we're basically working within the kind of material economies related to the material ecologies that are allowing us to build this at a certain rate. And I am probably over time, so I'll end there. But yeah, I mean, I think this question about stuff is super exciting to us and one that we've been exploring through this kind of lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jaffer. Next up, we have Sital Solanki. Sital Solanki is a translator of materials, the founder and director of Matter, a relational practice focused on building and bridging kinship between ourselves, materials, and the immaterial and virtual. Her work at Matter reorients mindsets, behaviors, and mechanisms towards futures that are caring and respectful by providing ecological and nuanced strategies that are biodiverse, inclusive, and responsible. The author of Why Materials Matter and a textiles tutor at the Royal College of Art and associate lecturer at CSM Spatial Practices in London. Welcome, Sital.
Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here virtually. I'm calling in from Lagos, Nigeria. I live here and also in London, UK. So yeah, I'm sending you some warm energy from my kind of view of the lagoon here. Today, I really wanted to just discuss material values, and that for me really has a connection to this whole symposium of post-commodities, and not just thinking about the physical or economical values that we're so used to understanding, but also thinking about values beyond material wealth and talking about immaterial wealth also. So really, as a society, we need to become more material literate in order to take better care of the planet we inhabit. Language provides us with the tools to shift perceptions and practices. Material vocabularies are typically small, limited, and misunderstood. Historical groupings such as wood, metal, and plastic enable us to understand where a material comes from, but it actually fails to explain the qualities in any depth. So I'll be kind of proposing alternative methods to reevaluating value within the material world and the immaterial world. It matters what matters. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to others. We tell other stories with. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And this is really prolific to me in terms of like how we can actually understand the mattering around matter. We are never without materials. These seemingly mundane fragments and blobs of metal, plastic, ceramic, and glass are the stuff from which our whole civilization is constructed. Yet perplexingly, while they do so much for us, we rarely pause to marvel at them. In fact, most of the time, we ignore materials. Their ubiquity is precisely the reason it's so easy to forget just how foundational a role they play in our experience of the world, of how we relate to and express love for one another, of the way we sculpt our bodies and identities, of how we fabricate the present and future of everyday life. Throughout history, societies have discovered and developed materials, made tools and artifacts from them, and in so doing, constructed themselves in the process. In many ways, we're living out the material dreams and needs of our ancestors, with much of the lifestyle that we're accustomed to today standing as a product of past inventions. In order to do this, we need to readdress the relationship we have with materials. This raises the questions around what will the next 50 years look like? What will we dream up? And most importantly, who gets to take part in that process? And this quote here is very apt in describing the way in which we're actually relating with the material world, the non-human world. There's such a disrespect and carelessness around how we treat them. And we're kind of forcing them into a realm where they're kind of framed in longevity, durability, and mass production. But actually, most materials have many different lifespans to them and huge amount of potentials rather than us kind of fixating them into a mass production and I think more of a capitalistic model, a human-centered model, in fact. We still have so much to learn from the planet. Exploring, experimenting, and working with the Earth's materials has led to so many groundbreaking discoveries, from the everyday to the unexpected and awe-inspiring. To date, human civilization has never existed without materials. They are the glue to our very existence, as ultimately everything is made from something. But we've abused our time on Earth, stretching its resources to the ultimate brink in a bid to feed our all-consuming culture an ever-growing need to own and to experience. All forms of life are equally precious, and so are their needs. The universe, contrary to common belief, was not created for humans alone, but human behavior tells a different story. Today, we create, cultivate, and continue to extract more from the planet without looking at the copious amounts of products that we already have. This mass consumption has resulted in piles upon piles of waste in landfills that we either export to other countries to deal with or burn, creating an insurmountable amount of pollution. We have all seen the tragically disturbing images and headlines, and sadly will continue to. These are the Earth's responses to our relentless activity. It is absolutely impossible to ignore the connection between human action and the accelerated environmental crisis we are currently experiencing. Indeed, our epoch has officially been named Anthropocene, marking the age of significant human impact of the Earth's geology and ecosystems, including the climate crisis. But what can we do independently and collectively to curb this disaster, if at all? In order to address the planetary scale problem and climate disaster, humanity needs to address its own internal imbalance. Our relationship with consumption is taking an enormous toll on the planet, which is in fact the evidence and external reflection of our incredibly damaged relationship with ourselves. Ultimately, in order to understand ourselves, we should first understand that our values interlink with our beliefs, which steadily influence our habits. Working backwards, we should start with the knowledge that we're part of something a lot bigger than ourselves, if only by understanding that it's our mutual responsibility to take care of the Earth. If we are to divert the current narrative, our relationship with value needs to be reframed. We're quickly moving into a world where the challenges and desires we're trying to address are far too complicated for researchers in any single subject area at any single scale to resolve. The skill of the 21st century's great thinkers will not be cleverness in one particular discipline, but rather knowing how to use materials as a bridge between disciplines. As a global society, we're going to need lots of people with different skills to tackle the complex issues that face us today. The power of materials is that they transcend the boundaries of multiple disciplines. They act as a catalyst for bringing diverse groups of agents together, whether it be engineers, designers, architects, biologists, botanists, farmers, environmentalists, or anthropologists. And this diagram that you see on this page here is really a snapshot in the life of myself and also my practice. And I really see materials and people working with materials as translators, and the way that we are kind of speaking and conversing and relating to all of these sectors and industries and people that work within them are through materials. Materials are, for me, the conduit to all life and all beings and all of these sectors and societies. Because for me, like, as I was saying earlier, material, everything is made from something and they are the materials. So it's just the fact that we speak very different languages when it comes to the way in which we relate to all of these sectors, whether it's the sciences or policy making or design, for example. The material is the conversation point and will always continue to be. It's just how we apply them. And that's the main difference ultimately. Could the responsible use of materials offer us an alternate reality? Materials grown from bacteria or mined from landfill could soon be a mainstream reality. This is all presented in Why Materials Matter, a book I had the privilege to write, which was published in 2018 by Prestel. I wanted to present the extensive vocabulary landscape that materials possess. So you will find materials made from bacteria, air, water, and even digital. There are examples from the experimental to the mass manufactured, large scale, from handmade to machine made, from physical to digital, from natural to synthetic, and from the ephemeral to the enduring. Overlaps between them prove that borrowing from other sectors and sharing techniques can help us progress towards a responsible future that is more accepting of an interdisciplinary design approach. By looking at a material's potential, we can shape new meanings with positive social, environmental, economical, and political effects. The field of materials is expanding at a rate faster than we could study, let alone master, with a recent estimate counting over 160,000 unique materials in the world. What's more, when we begin to study a material, we're immediately launched into an ever more complicated system of scales and structures. It's by looking at a material across these different scales, the nano, micro, meso, and macro, that we begin to understand its molecular makeup, mechanical properties, and experiential qualities. Complexity at this order of magnitude defies any single way of knowing. Rather, it necessitates an array of techniques from computational modeling and measuring to experimental trial and error to sensing and observation. Now, here's a little insight into a very brief methodology that I've been able to create under my practice. So really, I want everybody to kind of think about a material-driven, well, a material-first approach when it comes to design or any form of creation. We're so used to thinking about product first, and then the material is actually one of the last things that's considered, and it's kind of shoehorned into the design and the design, I guess, problem that we're kind of addressing. But by identifying a material first approach, it means that the outcome would be way more holistic and well considered when it comes to the individual use, a more planetary, healthy outcome as well. Because how we design is, well, actually, how we understand materials first is by typologies. And that's not actually that helpful because we don't understand the application of them or the processes of them or the actual qualities they possess, behaviors that they actually have. So I want people to understand the material's identity through their functional qualities and their emotional qualities. Because that's ultimately how we create, space. For example, here in the first section of identity, we design by understanding how a space functions or feels. So if we understand a material in that same way, we can apply the material into that space way more holistically. And then the people experience it or reside within it in some way. And therefore it leads us on to the next stage, which is the life cycles, whereby we're understanding the birth of the material, the source, where it actually comes from, the use of it, how it lives, the degradation of it, the decay, how it actually dies, and the reuse of it and how it's been reborn, or does it continue to have another life in another form, for example. And then the systems part of it is actually thinking about the application of these materials. So longevity is really about designing a material for durability. Modularity is kind of looking at design for disassembly. Versatility is very much looking at a single material and the versatile nature that it has. And I will show you an example of that in just a moment. Ability is really looking at how a material can be an enabler. So it's more kind of related to open source design, much like the precious plastics model, I would say. So it's kind of encouraging people to be part of the process. Now, an example of this, of like how I would describe a materials designer or creator or practitioner, is very much how a cook or a chef works with an ingredient or ingredients. So we have an example of eggs on your screen here, and how the ingredient of eggs is processed through these alchemic properties. It has an entirely different texture or experience even, whether it's poached, fried, scrambled, baked, so on and so forth. The process in which that it takes just has an entirely different application and experience in this case, because it's food. So I like to call this algae 10 ways. Algae produces up to 80% of the world's oxygen and therefore can be considered one of the most important organisms on our planet. Its ability to grow in abundance, at speed, and be harvested in our oceans poses a solution to the constraints we are faced with due to increasing pressures on land. So hereby we have an example of algae, macroalgae, kelp, in fact, in a human scale structural capacity. So it's looking at its strength. And then here we have an example of its biodegradable nature, of looking at it as a plastic alternative. And then here we have an example of it as yarn and also as color, dye. And then paints, so you can see here like the frames, the metallic frames here are painted with algae, and then the fabric is also seaweed, and then the biodegradable plastic alternatives on this little side table here. And then we're looking at here something that's more kind of all-encompassing and thinking about like, how do you use the entire body of seaweed and the qualities that it possesses. So the gelatinous, sticky, slimy sort of texture that it has is a glue, ultimately. So it's been a binding agent for this seaweed-based material that turns it into a solid surface. And then here we have a more architectural scale example where it's looking at it as an insulator and also as thatching. And this is kind of taking an example, this is more contemporary from a very historical example where it's kind of looking at seaweed as thatching and very coastal areas of Denmark, for example, but it's just framed aesthetically different. Food. We know a lot of Eastern cultures have algae in their diets on a daily basis, perhaps, but this is kind of an example of what it could potentially be for IKEA's future meatball. Then here we have algae as an example of photosynthesizing this entire building to provide energy to the entire building. And that's what happened for it. In 2 weeks solid, this entire building was operated just by algae. It's almost like behaving as a bioreactor of sorts. And then here we have an example of it as ink. So it can be placed onto fabric and also paper. And all the different color variations you see on this is looking at the different colored species that we have access to on the coastal regions of most of the planet, actually. And then here we have an example where it could actually potentially power your home through a photosynthetic device. So applying digital technology into it. So this is really the versatile nature of one single material. And like I was describing, 160,000 unique materials that we have access to at an industrial scale, but we're not really using all of those materials to their full potential. Now, if we were to see like how one organism or one material can be applied in all of these variety of ways, it means we're actually harnessing the material's full potential and valuing that material and all the many personalities that it can actually take, much like us as human beings, really. We're kind of, I'm in an effort to humanize materials so that we can actually relate to them and value them very differently and care and respect for them, much like we're trying to do with ourselves. And that kind of gives us more of an effort to look after the planet even further. Okay, so I'm just going to put the volume a bit low. Hopefully you can hear my voice. The material world is on the brink of a paradigm shift. As the lines between the physical and digital blur, the pixels and photons inside our mobile phone, the plastics and metals on its exterior, the very notion of a material is changing. Digital materials provide seemingly endless possibilities. The freedom to create in a digital space foregoes the limitations of the physical world, and materials can be manipulated, expanded, and reimagined in ways that wouldn't be possible in a physical reality. Value systems are being appended in a digital material world. Where there's no material hierarchy. Designers are questioning the hierarchy of value and labor. Within our physical world, materials come at a cost, whether that is monetary or at a cost to the planet. Digital materials are not faced with those types of complications. In a digital space, marble or wood can be considered equal in value, even though in the actual physical realm, they have differing price tags. Throwing out our pre-existing material conventions, are we seeing an extension of our current material language whereby wood can be warped into a more fluid-like state? The potential is infinite within the digital sphere. Regarding the digital, emphasizing the emotional and the tactile side of materials, objects, and textures to give the digital a more human, relatable quality and create more meaningful connections. But how do designers and makers evoke emotion when creating works with no haptic stimuli? And how do they make the intangible tangible? Today, a new generation of digital craft workers and tinkering and are hacking and tinkering with code and software to create images, objects, and experiences rich with texture and nuance. Now, what I would like to also bring up here at this very moment is to kind of consider this idea of a universal language of materials, because here we're by seeing a whole new language of materials and values, whereby materials are kind of being expanded into other areas of possibilities. So the digital material language is incredibly different to the physical language, and therefore have a whole different value system attached to it as well. So this idea of a universal language of materials is so difficult to convey. And actually, I would say it's impossible, in fact, because how people interpret materials in culture, through an embodied intelligence, through different forms of language, whether it be spoken or written or something that's more based on sound, is so uniquely different. And therefore, we can't expect to have a universal form of language. It's so much more nuanced than that. And therefore, material culture is a really big part of what we're kind of implementing and integrating and sharing. Playing with perception is a recurring theme with the creation of a digital material. Digital materials are simply just layers of information, something that Ada Lovelace was exploring way back in the 1800s. Coding is a form of textile making and production, as there's always some form of pattern to follow and construct. These are similar processes of information, decoding information to deconstruct and reconstruct something that is intangible, in fact. 2 minutes. Ooh, I'm stuck. Okay. I'm just going to flick through these ones. So we're describing a post-human world where we're kind of reducing ourselves. Oh, it's stuck. I'm so sorry. One moment. And this idea behind consumption and collectible design, that's really shifting the way that we're kind of designing and creating, and it's becoming more of an art form, in fact. And even the physical art form is changing the way that we consume at a rate of where it's not kind of considering a mass consumption model. And I will just end by saying, warping the rules of physics from the physical world into the digital world helps bridge the physical-digital divide and encourage designers to question what materials are and what can be achieved with them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sital. We're going to take a quick 5-minute break. We do have a fun offering. We are putting up a code where you can kind of enter this kind of 3D world that we've made through AR in your phones, if you so desire. Come join us there. We'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay. Hi, everyone back. We have a quick video from Sophia that we're going to put in before Jack's keynote discussion. So we're running about like 10 minutes late. Sophia Pia Belenki is an architect based in Milan. Sophia Pia works as a researcher and designer at Space Caviar, and previously collaborated with a number of offices in New York, London, and Paris. Her work with Space Caviar uses events and exhibition design, research, build work, writing, and film as forms for an extended mode of architectural practice, and has recently published the book Non-Extractive Architecture, which is very relevant to our sort of topics today. So we're excited to show Sophia's work. Welcome, Sophia.
Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Sophia. Hi, thanks for having me. My name is Sophia Pia Belenki, and together with Space Caviar, we have recently launched the project Non-Extractive Architecture, which is a live research platform focusing on the rethinking the balance between the built and the natural environment, the role of technology and politics in future material economies, and the responsibility of the architect as an agent of this transformation. It's a year-long program at VAC Zatre, but it's really a project with long-term ambitions. This is the cover image of the book, Volume 1, Non-Extractive Architecture, on Designing Without Depletion, and it's an image of the Barcelona Pavilion by Armin Linke. And in the past, maybe I looked at an image like this and I said, like, wow, what a beautiful building, what a masterpiece, what a fantastic piece of marble. But now I think what the project Non-Extractive Architecture aims to do is to reframe an image like this and to create discussions around ideas of externalities and that go into making architecture. So what were the consequences of removing this stone? Where did it come from? Who are the bodies that cut it? And what does the site look like now that it is gone? Non-extractive architecture is about creating an architecture that does not produce externalities, that does not deplete resources or exploit the planet and the humans that inhabit the planet. If we think about architecture, it's clear that there's a big role for us to play as architects in climate change and a huge responsibility for change. And so this requires a massive rethinking of the way that we make architecture and the way that we design. As we know, buildings create about 40% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions. And here you can see if concrete was a country, it would be the third largest carbon emitter in the world. So, I mean, I think we can't simply make buildings more efficient. We have to start by questioning why we build, or if we build in the first place. And this is going to be a massive shift in the way that we also teach architecture. So this project is really trying to broaden the discourse around architecture. It's much bigger than making energy efficient buildings. I think this is something at this point we should take for granted, but it's going to require a complete rethinking about the way we make architecture, that it is not reliant on such long distance supply chains or externalities, for example. So we launched this project, but in a way we've launched it many years before. It's very connected to all of the work that we're doing at Space Caviar, but we're really happy to have this space, VAC Zatre, which is a fantastic foundation based in Venice, Italy. Its main foundation is based in Moscow, but they have this fantastic satellite space in Venice. And we have a year-long project here developing this research with Space Caviar and a group of 10 research residents that are joining us in the space. And I keep saying project rather than exhibition because it is really a platform for thinking, for bringing together people, for creating a network of people that are already doing fantastic work on this topic. So it's really an attempt to imagine a form of architecture which can create an alternative value system and also change the way that we speak about architecture or teach architecture. Some of the questions that we're asking, for example, is what if architecture were understood first and foremost as a form of stewardship rather of the built and natural environments? So thinking of architecture as someone that cares for buildings, that maintains, that maybe takes also advantage of occupying existing structures and renovating and maintaining rather than building new. I think also the redesigning of economies is a really important part of this conversation. We are bringing together a lot of economists, both in the first volume of the book, but also towards the second volume. And I think this is going to be a crucial part of the conversation, that capitalism doesn't need to be a function of growth necessarily. And how can we think about sort of the long-term goals and the long-term consequences of well-being, both for the planet and for the people that occupy it. And also looking at the sort of invisible supply chains, or the invisible material economies and threads that we build from. So thinking about bringing all of this much closer to home, showing where the materials are coming from, and exposing the sort of pit that becomes the tower, and showing the sort of direct consequences on the land of the buildings that we make. We're really interested in perhaps architecture not being primarily about form, but more about flows, about energy flows, about material flows, and human flows. So the project launched with this first book this spring. It's Non-Extractive Architecture Volume 1, and it's intentionally Volume 1 because Volume 2 will be a collection of all of the research, all of the ideas that unfold over the coming year in Venice and beyond, and I'll go into that a little bit further. But this book was really about sort of setting the theoretical framework for the type of research we wanted to happen in Venice, and bringing together a lot of interesting voices, such as architects and geographers and historians, but also economists, philosophers, artists, and kind of creating a cross-section of a network that we were interested in exploring further with Volume 2. This is an image by Charlotte Malter-Barthes, Scales of Extraction, looking at all of the elements that constitute a building and all of their material composites. This is an image from the book also, from Luke Jones, looking at the flows of carbon between a forest and a building. Luke was also one of the research residents in Venice during the first cycle, and he developed that work further. So non-extractive architecture is articulated through sort of parallel research initiatives, such as this residency program and weekly public program, publishing and broadcasting, that all intertwine and become part of this exhibition and book that is evolving and taking form over the course of a year. We like to think of the Palazzo that used to be maybe a museum as now an open door studio. So we're taking it over as our second office space with Space Caviar, but also with the research residents. And each week the research residents are developing their personal individual projects, but also this really larger, maybe more importantly, larger communal and collective research, which is documenting and collecting case studies of labor laws, community initiatives, design strategies, economic frameworks, policies, and materials that we can all look to when building in a non-extractive way. So we're trying to collect this sort of library of ideas and bring them together in the space. And so when we started this exhibition, we wanted to make something that didn't produce waste, that was mobile and collective, that could expand. And so we really began the exhibition with just simply white pieces of paper nailed in a grid on the walls. And in a way, these pieces of paper have become a live notebook for the research to unfold each week and accumulate on the walls. And also, in a way, a page plan for Volume 2. This was inspired by the UNESCO Human Rights Exhibition in 1949, which made this sort of traveling exhibition to share the values and ideas around human rights. And they made 110 annotated images on just simple pieces of paper that were traveling around the world to share this knowledge. And we're sort of faced with a similar problem. How do we make vocabulary around these ideas of non-extractive architecture? So together with Interiors Agency, Nicholas Korody, who I believe is also speaking today, we developed this exhibition schema that allows us to share this knowledge as quickly and as openly as possible. There's just some images from Nick's contribution also to the book in volume 1. So it's really an exhibition that produces more exhibitions, that is downloadable, that's flat pack, and easily shareable. And to do this, we made the exhibition format editor with F451, which allows us to translate the research into a sort of exhibition form and also a book form. It organizes all of the research into an online archive that we're building over the years, and allows for the imagery to be printed and published, with sort of also relieving the labor involved in graphic design for the research residents, so that they can focus more on the research and less on making pretty PDFs to make in a book or exhibition. And for us, it was really important also that this content could be shared as widely as possible. So the exhibition format editor distorts the imagery enough to with a bitmap texture that allows it to be scaled really easily along the walls. So here's some images of us testing and the research unfolding in real time. Another really important part of the exhibition is a materials laboratory, which was the only other thing that we installed in the space at the beginning of the exhibition, besides the white pieces of paper on the wall. And the materials laboratory is a space for us to test material samples and prototype towards non-extractive architecture materials, but also to build anything that we need for the exhibition. So this space, we wanted to really make an exhibition without waste, without unnecessary pedestals and tables. So anything that we've needed for the exhibition as it unfolds over the year, we built using supplies on hand and directly in the palazzo. So here is a table that is slowly being filled with material samples that are produced in this workshop, but also from designers and industry leaders that we invite to display their product. And we're trying to create this sort of library of material samples that can be then shared in the future towards the second volume of the book, but also towards many other exhibitions and conversations that we hope will unfold. So every 2 weeks or so, we invite a different designer to come and activate that workshop space and do a material workshop with the residents. But also the residents are developing projects, like this is a start of a building that's being built inside the palazzo, a small house by one of the researchers, Davide Talibue, and he's looking at sort of DIY construction techniques that he can learn from YouTube and produce within the facilities of the foundation and our workshop space. And this is the first wall of the building, which is cross-laminated timber, but instead of with glue, with dowels. And in the background, you can see some of the research that's unfolding on the walls of case studies, as well as a 3D printer from Wasp 3D that one of the other researchers, Brenda Freitas, is using to experiment with mud from the surrounding Venice as a potential material for 3D printing. Sorry about that. Almost done here. And we make the exhibition through 3 tools. One is a publishing station, and these 3 sort of tools or equipment to produce the exhibition were designed with N55 XYZ cargo, and they're all mobile units. So the idea is that these 3 tools can move and continue the research and continue to activate different spaces after the year-long exhibition and platform at VAC. So the first is this publishing station where we publish the research. The second is a broadcasting station where we host weekly interviews and conversations with guests and stream them into a blog that is also transcribing all of the conversation towards volume 2 of the book. And the third is a library where, of course, we research and read. And this library is also collecting sort of the several hundred most important texts on this topic that will go on to be the sort of non-extractive architecture library that we hope to share with a larger public. And again, these these vehicles are really vehicles because we want to extend this research as much as possible to share it with as many people and as many organizations and schools, and really continue this as an ongoing archiving project, which we are archiving physically within the Palazzo, but also online, like I mentioned. And we will soon open this archive up to the public that can add to this research as we attempt to form a really large network of people and ideas working on this topic. And again, all of this is going to be collected in volume 2 of the book, which will come out next fall and will be a sort of like handbook or phone book of sorts that looks to collect and share all of the interesting materials, all of the fantastic ideas that are around this topic, because of course this is not something new or invented by Space Caviar in any way, but it's there's so many interesting people already also part of this conference working on these ideas, and this project is an attempt to bring them all together in an ongoing research residency program and multiple publication program. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that wasn't too long, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and to all the presenters who shared their work today. We're looking forward to a discussion with all of the presenters after the keynote address, which I am here to introduce. I wanted to use this opportunity to reflect a little bit on the symposium and the kind of significances, small and large, and thank Laida in today's presentations. And I think today, and it might be because the sun is out, I'm struck by the tone of curiosity and experimentation, what we can do with materials, how we might confront and rethink persistent values like disposability or sanitation to kind of alter the way we interact with materials and non-human things. And so today's keynote speaker, Jack Halberson, is the perfect guide for showing us through the muck and locating maybe moments of brightness, reflecting back to us as students and practitioners of architecture, the spatial dimensions of stuff, sexuality, dispossession, and collapse. Jack Halberson is professor of gender studies and English at Columbia University. Halberson is the author of 7 books, including Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters, Female Masculinity, In a Queer Time and Place, The Queer Art of Failure, Gaga Feminism, Sex, Gender, and the End of Normal, and a short book titled Trans, A Quick and Dirty Account of Gender Variance. Halberson's latest book is titled Wild Things, The Disorder of Desire. And probably of interest of us as architects and designers, the Places Journal awarded Halberson its Arcus Places Prize in 2018 for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and the built environment. Halberson is now finishing a 2nd volume on wildness titled Unworlding and Aesthetics of Collapse. Halberson was recently the subject of a short film titled So We Moved by Adam Pendleton. It is playing at MoMA until January 30th, 2022. So check it out if you're in New York. And I want to note that this keynote is co-sponsored by University of Michigan Arts Initiative Future of Arts series. Jack, if you're here somewhere, we welcome you into this hybrid environment, and we're very excited about your presentation. Please join me in welcoming Jack Halberson.
Okay, I'm hoping someone will tell me if you cannot see or hear me. Or if you cannot see the slide that I'm sharing. So thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this really amazing, thought-provoking conference. I've already learned a lot just from being here for a couple of hours. And I love the idea of the sort of the brightness in this bleak moment. I'm not sure I'm going to play that role, since I am thinking here about unworlding and collapsing. But I am deeply interested in the questions that people are asking at this conference about worlds after stuff and design and architectural solutions to the current environmental crisis that we find ourselves in. So a couple of things by way of a kind of preliminary entry into the category of unworlding. I mean, even in the presentations today, there's a kind of a presumption that as critics, as thinkers, as designers, as architects, that we are somehow interested in world building. And I'm not sure about that. I'm going to make an argument today that it's quite possible that the whole concept of world, let alone the concept of building, is part of our problem. And so there was a quote offered earlier about making worlds with critters. I think it was from Donna Haraway. And I wonder whether that is the best relationship that we should be taking up to these lively worlds of material being and animality and so on, or whether there's a way in which the human and everything that the human brings with it needs to get out of the way. So that might be part of what's behind unworlding. And so my work in recent years, particularly in relationship to the Arcus Prize essay that I wrote on Gordon Matta Clark, is very interested, in fact, in artists who have made it their mission to literally take on the project of an architecture or unbuilding. And I'm interested, I guess, today in thinking with you. Many of you are working in the fields of design and architecture, thinking with you about the architecture and the design elements of unbuilding and collapsing. So before we get into that, let me see if I can say something necessary about the category of unworlding that this new book that I'm working on is trying to figure out. So this new project is very much going back to the 1970s, and I'll say why in a moment. And it's looking into the past rather than to the future for models of ways of being in relationship to the environment, urban or rural, that are not, as we heard, are not extractive, but are also not speaking in the language of doing, making, becoming, and instead presents an aesthetic vision using terms like stopping, dismantling, cutting, quieting, collapsing, and unbecoming. And I just offered you an image here of the Bronx in the 1970s to remind us that in the 1970s, many of the places that we now call global cities were in an active state of collapse. And you can see similar images of London in the 1970s that still looked like London was completely bombed out after World War II. Here, the apartment buildings are bombed out because unscrupulous landlords had firebombed their own apartment buildings in order to remove poor communities and then collect insurance, rebuild, and re-rent apartments at market value. That version of collapse, in which a sort of insurance scheme uses collapse to get to higher levels of extraction, needs to be countered, it seems to me, with a queer project around collapse. And that's what I will offer today. Why would we go back to the 1970s? And I don't mean to romanticize the 1970s, but a lot of the projects that we're hearing about here are future projects, as if we can, and I'm interested in them and I want to talk to people more about them. But I wonder if there's a fantasy that we can build our way out of the problems that surround us. And I wonder if even the most responsible projects might still be contributing to a kind of mania around building that needs to stop. In the 1970s, under the influence of a kind of rapacious capital, many cities were bankrupt. Certainly New York City was bankrupt. And so things were falling down and people were not building them back up. And that was very much the environment into which Gordon Matta Clark emerged, for example. And he often in his bio will hear that as a young person, he remembers that a building a few streets away from him collapsed, killing a schoolmate. But that that experience, in fact, of collapse, rather than deterring him from collapse or pushing him to think about building and safety and structure and support, led him to projects in which he sought out what he calls the space between structure and collapse. And I'm also deeply interested in that space, and I believe that that space characterizes much of the urban developments, let's say, of the 1970s. They were literally located between structure and collapse. Why else would we talk about the 1970s? Well, along with these sort of bombed out buildings were really creative projects around squatting. It was a lot easier to occupy a building than it is today with the intense digital systems of security that people have to contend with. There was no internet in the 1970s, which meant that people were finding each other using very different relationships to time and space. And I wonder, you know, I've actually written a manifesto called the Off Manifesto, in which I argue that we all get off, literally get offline. And I'm not sure that that's, you know, anything that anyone is particularly going to do, but we might at least remember what it was like to live in space prior to the internet. And I'll give the example of a project organized around cruising pre-internet, and we'll look at the way in which collapse plays a massive role in that project. Of course, the 1970s was also a period of heightened rebellious energy coming from situationists, anarchists, not just hippy-dippy sort of new age ethos of flow, but also angry, anti-colonial, anti-imperial projects oriented around refusal and resistance. So for those reasons, and maybe they're not enough, but for those reasons, I'm heading back to the 1970s and trying to look there for examples of not just models of collapse, but actually an aesthetics of collapse that might orient us away from these doing projects and towards projects in which we become much more comfortable with, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, detumescence. Okay, so that's going to be one of my critical vocabulary terms, detumescence. Are we too almost phallically invested in erecting things? And should we actually be more interested in a kind of aesthetics of impotence? I'm just going to offer, this is a work called We Are Not by Adam Pendleton, that I think is thinking in ways that I'm also thinking about unmaking identities, unmaking language, unmaking the relationship between the background and the figure, the lettering and the canvas, language and meaning. When I say unworlding, I fear that I'm going to have to read Heidegger in order to make real sense of the category of worlding, but I'll bravely do it. But worlding is one of these philosophical projects that has sort of propelled Enlightenment philosophies into the contemporary, even after in a kind of post-critical world. And we tend to think of world as a presumption of a totality of things. It's a mode of being that exists through the sorting of subjects from objects, subjects from things, and things from unseen forces. And given the work that we've already heard presented today about taking up different relationships to the material world and to material itself, I think you can begin to see why worlding is getting in our way rather than, you know, world building being the project that we want to join forces with. So world and life seem to offer utopian possibilities, but these are totalizing concepts, which, as Calvin Warren has suggested, are built upon an essential anti-Blackness. And I advise you to just read The Ontology of Terror by Calvin Warren, in which he asks, can Blacks have life? What would such life mean within an anti-Black world? And then he turns to Heidegger in order to take world apart, understanding that world is the sequence of relations that joins people to money, to place, and to time in the aftermath and the afterlife of slavery. And within that aftermath, Black continues to mean, in his terms, nothing. And you'll see that nothing plays a role in the work of unbuilding. Therefore, it shouldn't be a surprise that the work of unworlding has been taken up by Black science fiction writers. Certainly Octavia Butler it would be one person to go to, but I've been reading recently N.K. Jemisin, who in her Broken Earth trilogy, called, I read particularly, was interested in the 5th season, thinks about a world that is trying to literally throw humans off its surface. So this Broken Earth series is about the way in which humans have broken the world, and the world tries in response to break humans. And in between humans and the world are a set of sort of superhuman beings who can pay attention to the world's movements, read them, and predict the impending disasters. But the disaster is only warded off for a certain amount of time. In many ways, Jemisin's fiction is about the disaster that is already here and can only be undone by pushing out of world, okay? Now, you could take another route to unworlding, and you could go through, as many people have today, Anna Singh, for example, and instead of looking for this sort of monumental unmaking of the whole world, as we find in the Broken Earth series, you could think about a kind of swerving away from world in the way that Anna Singh does by looking to what she calls mutual worlds and the latent commons within them. And she does so by pursuing the life form of the mushroom. I think that in this way, Singh and then other people like Zakiya Jackson have offered us the language of entanglement, so that we're asked to think about the ways in which we are entangled in other life forces and cannot shake free of them without thinking in terms of collaborative survival. So in my project, unworlding means many things. It means, for example, in my Wild Things book, it was about shifting the relationship between animals and humans such that we register the ways in which humans believe in their humanity, not simply by exploiting animals within the production of food, but also in relationship to the domestication of them. And I argue in that book that the household pet is a place of much more vicious extraction in some ways than potentially even the meat industry. Why? Because there's an imaginary within the human that by taking up an intimate relationship to the animal, that we are good, that we are better, that we are somehow refiguring our relationships to the human, even as we leave all other relationships to food completely intact. And I think this is an extractive relationship where the labor that is being extracted is intimate rather than just physical. Finally, on unworlding, and then we'll dig into collapse in a moment. Well, what would this look like? You might say, oh, well, that's fine. That's fine to say that, but this has absolutely no political application. Actually, it does. And I direct you to the work of Argentinian feminist Veronica Gago, who recently published a book called Feminist International, in which she describes how to create a transversality, not universality, a transversality, or what she names a politics of construction, of proximity and alliances. And using this language of the transversal, Veronica Gago proposes the general strike as a way to stop the world. And the general strike here isn't the Marxist idea of a general strike where workers go on strike and refuse to do their labor. It's a recalibration of who needs to go on strike. And for her, it's all the people who are forced out of the labor market, including women who are at home with children, sex workers who are not recognized by certain labor laws, trans people who are pushed out of the labor market as well. That's the transversality, is to make solidarity between groups who are not well described in terms of labor. So the general strike is a much bigger project, and it's one in which strike occurs as what she calls a rupture and a process. It doesn't operate through doing, through making, or through building. It operates through a cessation of activity, a quieting down, a refusal, a stepping back. And in relationship to one of these activities, she writes, "We stopped doing." Okay, so just to say then that what she calls the desire to change everything is, and my work, I believe, is absolutely smack in the middle of that kind of project, the desire to stop everything. These are abolitionist projects. They are crafted out of a kind of anarchist desire and a transversal desire to literally stop the world. On behalf of that, then, I'm going to just, for the rest of my talk, give 3 examples of artwork and art practices that engage very differently with world, sexuality, body, and desire. And I could easily have added a whole section on Gordon Matta Clark, but I'll just invite people to read the essay that I wrote about a kind of transgender aesthetics in his work that comes out of these cuts and orientations towards collapse that he cultivates. But we will see a little piece of Gordon Matta Clark as we go. All right, so let me switch gears a little bit here then. And this should be number 2, but don't worry about it. To talk then about collapse. So I'm going to do this sort of quickly in the interest of time. This is an image by Alvin Baltrop, and I turned to his work after doing my essay on Gordon Matta Clark and realizing that many of the really, really great photographs of Day's End by Gordon Matta Clark are by Alvin Baltrop. And in a lot of the gay art history written by Douglas Crimp and Jonathan Weinberg and others, Baltrop is sort of idealized as the queer version, if you like, of Gordon Matta Clark. And so Gordon Matta Clark is cast as an interloper into the world of gay men who were cruising in the piers on the west side of New York City in the 70s and 80s. And Matta Clark was an interloper who was homophobic potentially and who was locking the gay men out of the places where he was working. But the fact that Baltrop took so many photographs of Day's End, and the fact that Baltrop's images need to be read in relationship to Matta Clark and Matta Clark's in relation to Baltrop, leads me to want to think differently about the relationship between collapse that Matta Clark's work engages and then collapse as it appears in Baltrop's work. And this is just a warm-up slide to train us, if you like, in how to see a Baltrop photograph. So this is an utterly typical Baltrop photograph. You get a very dark image, a relationship between collapsing architecture and water. Sometimes the water is reflecting the architecture. Sometimes it's just sort of absorbing it. And only after looking at the photograph for a little bit do you see in the very middle of it that there are 2 men having sex. And this distant point, there's just a little hint of flesh that is repeated in the image, the white image of the boat above, is almost all that a lot of the gay criticism has focused on, right? So the eye is not immediately drawn to the gay men having sex, and yet the fact that the gay men are there having sex means that for many, this is the totality of the photograph. And that is what I mean by worlding, where we see an entire landscape and we simply pick out the human image and then reinterpret the photograph in relationship to the human image. There are many reasons that the men in the photographs appear in the distance, partly because Baltrop was taking his pictures from a distance as potentially a voyeur, Also potentially not using very expensive lenses, because this was a very lawless place to go in the 1970s and 80s. But intentionality. There's also a possibility, given how often this particular arrangement of bodies and architecture appears in Baltrop's work, it's very possible that Baltrop found himself as captivated by the collapsing architecture as he was by the erotic image of sexual exchange. Before we get there, though, here's another image that I think could go into the archive of collapse very neatly, and this is by Rachel Whiteread. Obviously, it's called House, and it was her 1993 work that won her the big prize in the UK, but was widely despised in London. But what she had done is she went to the Miles End area to a public housing development that was being torn down, and she took a plaster cast of the inside of one of the houses slated for demolition. And I think this is really a really telling image. It's almost the mirror image of Matta Clark. Instead of all the beams coming down, she gives us a reminder that what's inside a house is space. It's just empty space. And it's, for me, it's a commentary on the way in which the housing market fails poor people on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a reminder of the speculation of the housing market and the way in which the housing market is selling you basically empty space for massive amounts of money. So this also is part of a whole orientation towards collapse. This was in the 1990s, but still. Okay, I'm going to keep going with the Baltrop. Here's another one. What is captured here is not a man actively having sex. And just a reminder for anyone who doesn't know, the piers are now a storied space of gay male cruising from the 1970s. The West Side Highway had collapsed. Speaking of collapse, in the 1970s, there was no way to get to the piers by car. They had been abandoned in the post-industrial era when the big trade ships no longer came up the Hudson. The police did not go to the piers because it was very hard to get to, and therefore you have a sort of lawless site occupied by homeless people, drug dealers and users, and gay men cruising, and there was overlap between all of those populations. And as we'll see in one of my examples, there are also women and girls in the piers, and there's a memorable film made about girls making their home in the piers. But this photograph is interesting to me for the way in which it captures what I was saying earlier about pre-internet cruising, the aimlessness, if you like, the chance nature of cruising. In a pre-Grindr era, you don't know if there's anyone around, and therefore cruising could be frustrating. It could be a long drawn out process. It was outside of capitalist time in the sense that there were no guarantees of any particular encounter. It was dangerous, both in terms of the collapsing spaces that people found themselves in, and in terms of all of the different activity going on around. And for all of those reasons, there was a frisson to the cruising that, even though Grindr has sort of tried to upload the algorithm of gay cruising, that frisson, we could say, is a kind of surplus. Here's another one in which, notice that, again, despite the fact that Crimp and Weinberg want to read these photographs as being about gay sex, here's an image that has actually nothing to do with gay sex. It's two men sort of holding each other in the light that it's quite romantic in many ways. It's also a kind of love in the ruins image. It's just about connection, but connection against the backdrop of a kind of emptiness, a kind of hollowed out space of encounter. And again, you can now begin to see, after seeing 4 or 5 of these images, how much the Baltrop photographs are formulaic. The encounter between the two men is centered. The backdrop is, very much taken up with the grandeur as well as the ruination of the piers. And yet, very little has been said about these collapsing architectures in the background. Here you finally get a sort of money shot where there are two men having sex, and yet you only see the blowjob partially through the collapsed girders that frame them, and in fact crisscross the body in ways that seem to be instructive. It's as if Baltrop is asking us to see the erotic intensity of collapse itself, rather than only seeing eros in the relationship between these two humans. So there's a distributed affect, if you like, of an erotics of collapse. The central image of sexuality is sort of then repeated across the landscape, and we're asked to read these girders and the steel and the shadows and the distribution of light as part and parcel of a larger erotic terrain. I'm using here, the method that I'm using by going back to the 70s is very influenced by Munoz's method in Cruising Utopia, in which he offered that his approach to hope in the book is, as a critical methodology, can be best described as a backward glance that enacts a future vision. And that's what I think I'm doing. I'm doing this backward glance that enacts a future vision. But unlike Jose, who was very, very oriented himself, even in this book, towards world building and very influenced by his mentor, Eve Sedgwick, to talk about world building, that's where we part ways. And I want to take up a few pieces from his archive on behalf of world unbuilding, or what he identifies in the work of Ray Johnson as nothing. So if you're going to invest in the category of collapse, then there are many things that go along with it. And you'll see how this then really relates to, I think, the notion of post-commodities. In the post-commodities world, the idea is to get rid of stuff, to think in terms of nothing rather than something. Well, that was Ray Johnson's project, actually. He saw the intense activity and attention that was being given to the happenings in New York City in the 60s and 70s. And he offered a series of events that he called nothings, where people showed up and nothing happened. And these are repeated in Jack Smith's work. He also created nothings events where he asked people to be in his warehouse at a very crazy time of night, and then he either didn't show up or he kept people waiting hours and hours and hours. And in a way, Munoz is saying that this work turns nothing into something. What I want to say is that actually the value of nothing is very meaningful in relationship to the concept that Laida's given us of post-commodity. And this is another figure who appears in Jose's book, Fred Harko, who repeated Yves Klein's famous leap into the void, but whereas Yves Klein was caught by a safety net, Harko, a sort of, a dancer who had only a little bit of success in the downtown scene in New York City, who was also speed-addled, went over to a friend's apartment on Cornelia Street and did what Jose describes as a perfect jeté out of the top window and danced to his death. And that also is a politics of collapse, a kind of claiming of death against the impulse to live as long as you possibly can, even when people living forever and ever is an enormous strain on the resources of the world that we live in. And you can see echoes of this in what's called the transhuman movement, which is a movement led by wacko physicists to bring technology to the point of what they call a singularity, at which point every cell in the human body will be able to be replaced so that people like these crazy physicists can live forever. Against that aesthetic, we offer an aesthetics of collapse, and to use one of Jose's terms, an aesthetics of the ephemeral, in which we embrace the ephemeral. And I know that sounds like it goes against the principle of recycling and so on. But when it comes to the human, we're worried about the ephemeral. We want to live forever, as the song goes. And we make enormous demands on the world that we inhabit for the some 92 years that we are here now. So an aesthetics of collapse is also about ridding the world of us. A few more Baltrop images, and I just want to sort of then pull this to a close. This is one of the few images by Baltrop where there may be a human or two humans in there somewhere, but I don't see them. One of the few he gave a title to, and he calls it Collapsed Architecture. And I guess what I'm saying is, while the material on gay cruising is super interesting, these so-called backdrops are in many ways offering us the drama of the image itself. And if we fail to look at that drama, we will not be able to gather the lessons about collapse that the images have to tell us, which is that there is an erotics of collapse. There is a power in collapse. There is a kind of organic decline that we need to make common cause with, live with, embrace, and maybe invest in as a kind of aesthetic principle. Here's another one without humans, and this one has a beautiful sort of folding, to use the word of Lucas Crawford, a trans architectural theorist. Crawford speaks in terms of something he calls the crumple, and I think that this is a perfect example of the crumple. It's not exactly a fold in that neat way that some plastic materials can fold. It's a way in which the building is unbuilding itself, if you like. It's a sign of a kind of agency within the building, where the building is performing, collapsing, and performing it in a way that gives rise to these absolutely gorgeous aesthetic shapes. So can we understand a kind of architecture that inheres to the building, and an architecture that inheres to the organic process of collapse, and start developing a vocabulary to read this collapse? I'm not going to focus today on the human images. Here are some of them. They're often inert. It often looks like, as in this one, as if the building is trying to shrug the human images off. Here you get this odd slanted angle on the concrete. And finally, I'm opposing it, therefore, to the sort of pneumatic investment in erection that you find in the work of art world darlings like Jeff Koons, who wants to sell people on the masculinist idea that everything can go up without coming down. And that's what these pneumatic puppies that litter the entrances to many museums around the world are doing. They're offering a kind of glorified image of pneumatic masculinity that is always pumped and always erect and in a kind of Viagra state of readiness. This repeats itself across all kinds of architectures, and can be countered, therefore, by these ruinous images that Baltrop offers, images that I think speak in terms of a really different masculinity that is about deflation rather than inflation, an impotent architecture that folds down into spaces that become uninhabitable for humans. It's almost as if the architecture is ridding itself of human presence. So that leads then to questions about dereliction, and I will only mention one project on dereliction, and it's one that is very much related, I think, in the contemporary scene to Gordon Matta Clark's work and to Alvin Baltrop, and that is contemporary Black artist Cameron Rowland, who does amazing projects that are very, very much in line with this post-commodities emphasis, in the sense that he is trying to devalue certain spaces. Now, in this project, Depreciation, he bought a piece of land in South Carolina that had previously been part of a slave plantation. And with reference to the sort of the promise of reparations that were made to Black people in the form of 40 acres and a mule, a promise, of course, that was never paid, never has been paid, never will be paid, he offers instead the project of depreciation. What he does in this work is he buys the piece of land, And then he devalues it until its value comes down to nothing. He builds nothing on it. He grows nothing on it. He makes nothing on it. No one lives on it. No one works on it. There's nothing there. And over the course of a short period of time, the value of the land comes down to nothing. And at that point, the project is complete. Now, while that may sound purely conceptual and symbolic when it comes to a piece of land in South Carolina, Roland amazingly has done something similar in relationship to art museums. And so the ICA, for example, in London, is full of mahogany that was cultivated using slave labor. He placed a lien, a loan of a certain kind, on the mahogany in the museum, saying that the museum owed a debt to the slave labor that had been used to collect the mahogany, and that debt would be paid against the value of the building until the value of the building went down to nothing. And that it will take 50 years, and the museum has signed off on it, which is an incredible thing that he got the museum to sign off on that. And he is literally trying to drain the art market of its value. And I think that that practice and process of depreciation has to be at the heart of a post-commodities project. And here we are again back at then the value of nothing. Nothing is a very, very important part of Roland's work. Instead of building things that appreciate in value, that inflate in value, that acquire equity, he wants to reduce architectures down to nothing. And so in financial terms, in capitalist terms, in material terms, can we rethink a relationship to nothing? And Matt Clark made a huge deal out of nothing. And one of his big slogans, of course, was nothing works. And here's one of those beautiful images of Day's End that Baltrop took, suggesting that Baltrop was not only interested in the gay man cruising, he was also deeply interested in the relationship between the structure and collapse. And in the collapsing process that Matt Clark enables and engineers, he is putting to work this slogan that nothing works, nothing can work, nothing can do work. And the work that nothing does is a post-commodity work. And there's finally one of these images that now brings together Matt Clark, Alvin Baltrop. None of these guys are necessarily having sex. So this is a different kind of architecture of gay masculinity that is not reduced to the pornographic or fetishized in images of sexual contact, but is about a kind of sociality gathered around the site of a cut, not the phallic architecture of the building that is erect, but a different, not an anti-phallic architecture, but an architecture built around the cut, the collapse, and the impotent. And here's the image that you will now see where Day's End once was, which is David Hammond's beautiful homage to Gordon Matt Clark, also called Day's End, which he made the Whitney, and in one of these depreciation schemes, he made the Whitney pay a shitload of money for this steel frame, basically a climbing frame of sorts, that went up overnight, that people just really don't like. I love it. I ride by it on my bike nearly every day. And I think that the relationship that it's articulating between land, water, and frame and nothing is everything. That's what the architectural project is. What do we have now? Instead of this articulation of nothing, we have too much of a something, global apps that have uploaded formulas for gay desire and have transformed cruising from an anti-capitalist activity to one of the most profitable online businesses in the world, masquerading very often as progressive because you can, gay men can find each other in places that are explicitly homophobic. But believe me that wherever Grindr is, some government has been paid a lot of money or is paying a lot of money to have it there. So the Grindr is sort of the end of this 1970s orientation around a slow collapsing desire. Okay, I just have two, that was my main example from the 70s, but I want to end then with two other examples that I'll do much more quickly, only because I don't want to just have this understanding of the peers as simply about a kind of a gay male or a straight male playground for thinking about these ideas. I want to remind people of the greatest queer film that people have never seen, which is Times Square, made by the guy who made Saturday Night Fever, if you can believe it, and featuring two young girls who go on the run in New York City to the tune of I Want to Be Sedated by the Ramones. And instead of like, you know, trying to find safe space, they go right into the heart of the red light district of Times Square and make common cause with the pimps and the hustlers and the prostitutes working there, and build a movement that they call the Sleaze Sisters, and in the meantime, make their home where else but in the piers. And when I was in the warm-up space, this video doesn't play very well. So it's only very short. I'm not sure if it's going to, you know, be too jittery, but I'm going to try and play it for you. It's a great scene in the middle of the film where the two girls are united in the space of the piers by the ruination and collapse that surrounds them and by their commitment to each other.
Back porch. My bad. Never see. Why didn't I realize it before? God, did I see it? Don't you realize this is it? This is the place. I'll show you, watch this. Hey, blood. Now give me yours. Come on, don't worry. I ain't gonna hurt you. Just relax. That's all. Now, I want you to listen to me. You ever feel like freaking? You get panicky, shaky? I want you to call my name. Just screaming. Scream it as loud as you can. You know, like this. Perry! Perry! Nikki! Louder. Nikki! Perry! Nikki! Perry! Nikki!
Okay, I love that final scene where their voices are sort of ricocheting around the empty space of the piers, and the sound, it becomes a whole echo chamber for the sound of two girls screaming each other's name. And that, you know, in that way, they sort of recede into this world of dispossession and make common cause with the transversally, if you like, with the populations there. All right, I just want to conclude then with offering the third example that I'll be writing about in this book which is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed from 1974. And The Dispossessed, which is one of the very few anarchist sci-fi novels ever written, is an amazing meditation on dereliction and dispossession. And I just have two quotes by way of conclusion from Le Guin. One is, those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to unbuild walls. And so here you can hear the kind of abolitionist project, the anti-carceral project that is embedded in a project of dispossession. But what does dispossession mean? In the book, there are two worlds. There's a capitalist world and there's an anarchist world. And the anarchist world is literally the space that I'm calling unworlding, unworlded. It's a space where people have left the capitalist world, gone off to their own very desolate planet. They are instructed by the teachings of an old woman called Odo, and they have learned to set up an anarchist society where everyone works Everyone does the shit work and the good work. Everyone takes care of everyone's children. People sleep with men or women. Gender is not set in the way that it is in a capitalist society. And there are problems too. Art is not particularly valued. Originality is not particularly welcomed. And there are signs that life is so hard that it cannot go on. So when Shevik, the hero, is invited to the capitalist planet on account of some research he's done, he is absolutely seduced by capitalism. And at first he completely fills up on alcohol, sweets, in the leisure time that he is given to do his work, and he is completely won over by capitalism. But eventually his complete joy turns to disgust. And at that moment, he's contacted by an underground movement we can call today the post-commodities uprising. And these folks ask him to come and speak. And speaking like a true post-commodities activist, he addresses the crowd on behalf of nothing. He says, "We know that there is no help for us but from each other, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give." And here's a little tiny glimpse of not just world or life in a post-commodities future, but relation, what it would mean to live without owning. To be free here means to be freed from the worlds of commodity exchange, possession, ownership, buying, trading, use value, profit, and so on. All we have is what we are and what we give. And maybe we can find in this kind of vision of dispossession some of the political coordinates of a post-commodities future. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, for that wonderful lecture, very inspiring. And there are many, many things that I hope we can weave into this discussion with the other presenters. And I think we're looking for their images to come on screen in a minute. I'm wondering if others can see me right now. Because I actually brought a prop. I warned Laida that I would bring a prop for this scenography that Laida and their team has created today. It's a prop that I think is appropriate both for the kind of aesthetics of this environment, but also I think it's appropriate for kind of drawing together some of the themes that came up today. So let me see if I can lift it up. And in fact, maybe there's a way to get it close to the camera. But what I'm holding is a chunk of bricks that have become a kind of rock. And do you want to hold this close to the camera? It's kind of heavy, sorry. And it's a brick rock that I picked up a few years ago on the waterfront of Toronto. It's an area known as the Leslie Spit, which maybe some of you have visited. And it's a neighborhood that particularly in the 70s and 80s when it was created, it was a landform that was created out of the demolition of buildings as they were kind of clearing the way for new development in the city. And the area took on a similar role as the piers that Jack described in the lecture, where it was a place for illicit activities, it was a place for sexual encounters, it was a place for drug use and purchasing. And I think for me, when I visited, this is now a kind of park with a very vibrant wildlife. It's a place for riding your bicycle and kind of going for a run. But the brick itself is one of many of these kind of chunks of material that came from that initial dumping. So there's concrete and all of these, but you'll see that the brick or the bricks no longer function as bricks. They're rounded by the Lake Ontario's tidal movements. And so it can no longer stack in the way that a brick is meant to stack. But it also has this beauty to it, which of course is why we filled up our car. We kind of filled up our arms and carried a bunch of these objects home because we became very attached to them and their beauty. So I brought it today as a prop to maybe instigate a discussion and again, kind of pull on the threads that I think came up today. And I think particularly in Jack's lecture, the role of aesthetics, and particularly in the Baltrop photographs of kind of in framing these spaces of ruination and this kind of space of otherness. But at the same time, there's a kind of aestheticizing this architecture that is no longer functional as architecture. There's a kind of danger of collapse. So I'm just kind of curious about that, maybe a kind of knife's edge of the role that aesthetics play, Jack, in the work that you presented, but maybe that's something that the other presenters might touch on as well in terms of in framing or transforming the way we see waste materials or these kind of artifacts of unbuilding. Oh, I see. I think we lost a couple of our speakers. I see Jack and Joffer. Is that enough of a prompt for a response?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll just start, and I think that's really right, Meredith. That I'm trying to put a certain emphasis on aesthetics because sometimes, as James C. Scott proposes in Seeing Like a State, the aesthetic makes something seem doable or right or proper in the way that a city grid will make the city feel orderly, as if that's a good thing, but won't ask any questions about how a city should function. And in the same way, of course, we think, well, a collapsing architecture is unsafe. There's nothing that we can do with this. And yet, the aesthetic doesn't demand that we do something with it. The aesthetic is also just interested in ways in which we are envisioning relationship to things and to the non-human, or it's changing the way that we can imagine that relationship. And I think that's what I'm quite drawn to in Baltrop's work. It's like, well, yeah, the charisma of the image of people having sex is there, but there's so much more happening in those photographs. And I'm moved by the photograph's own interest in this other scene of aesthetic and erotic activity. And I'm trying to make sense of it for projects that are counterintuitive in that they are not world building. They are literally about trying to unmake the world in order for anything else to ever happen. So we have Jaffa, do we have no other people here?
I think that is true.
That is true for the moment, yes.
Cool. I'm happy to chat with Jaffa.
It just got intimate. Let's keep it small.
Yeah, Jack, great to see you again, and I'm glad got to see your keynote. Yeah, I mean, I think the answer, of course, is yes to the question, Meredith. Like, I think aesthetics matter here, and I think like the kind of exciting moment that we're in now, and the reason that these types of symposia are so exciting to me is that it feels, I don't know, to touch on your earlier point about the kind of optimism of the day, maybe versus the kind of like gloominess. And Jack, I actually found yours optimistic, not gloomy, in the end. So I think we'll like happily take you on team, like, I don't know, maybe there's like a pess optimism that we're working in. And it's probably the pess optimism is actually our moment right now, not really optimism or pessimism, but yeah, I mean, I think aesthetics matter, and on the one hand, that's like the easy answer to your question, but the difficult one is like what that looks like, and I think we're all testing those boundaries right now, and like I think whether you're sort of like interested in the kind of aesthetics of collapse, which I think is a very exciting territory to be in, or the kind of aesthetics of reuse, or the aesthetics of kind of material innovation and the kind of like composite hybrid material. All of them seem to indicate like a new direction of unknowability, and to a certain degree, a direction of the grotesque, right? And that seems to actually be a sort of aesthetic moment that we're in, is like to resist the kind of like late capitalist, neo-capitalist aesthetics of perfection and seamlessness, and like the kind of smoothness of, maybe like the late modern, transition into like the kind of 70s, 80s, like, airport aesthetic of everything having to like look perfect. And I think we're all kind of struggling with ways of dealing with failure, imperfection, inherited conditions, the grotesque, like things that are just inherently unknowable. And that is, the work that I find really compelling now, and work that we're sort of interested in as well. So I do think that we're in kind of like a great moment for that, and it's important to the project. I think there's also, I know we're kind of dealing with a fuzzy territory right now, but there's a kind of tacit straw man of greenwashing or whatever when we start talking about some of these issues. And I think like the assumption that things need to look a certain way in order to kind of demonstrate performing in a certain way is something that we also try and resist, while also trying to kind of explore and mine the potential that certain aesthetic forms have now that were not available to us in previous kind of eras of design.
Mm-hmm. I want to push on this a little bit further, because I think, we're here in Ann Arbor, we're very close to Detroit, which has this kind of reputation or aura around its ruination, and the kind of imaging of that ruination and the aestheticizing of that ruination. And I wonder if, part of the production of engaging with that imagery or with that aesthetics is producing the conditions of commodifying that aesthetic. So for example, I feel like I could open a kind of Etsy store and sell these rocks that I found in Toronto, because I think they have a kind of allure and beauty to them. And so at what point does that sort of spawn a kind of another cycle where that aesthetic that you're describing as grotesque or monstrous becomes desirable and becomes more, I don't know, like prevalent and kind of produces a kind of commodification? Like, is that a kind of, I think particularly Jaffer as a designer, is that something that you weigh in, thinking about the aesthetics of your work? Do you feel like you have to kind of keep it on this edge of grotesqueness in order for it not to kind of fall into like the kind of shabby chic, or like other kinds of ways that something that previously might have been considered grotesque is now more accepted, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and I'll keep it quick because Jack, I know you're about to say something, but look, this is like the whole project of queerness itself, right? Which is that like dominant society always catches up with queerness no matter what happens. And like the kind of like terms of aesthetic production always become enfolded, like folded into or like usurped by a kind of dominant culture. So my strategy is a dumb one, Meredith, which is that I don't overthink it. Like I can't, right? Like, of course, the thing that's grotesque is going to end up being co-opted by mainstream culture. It's going to enter the Etsy store and we're just going to have to keep moving forward. And trying to kind of like predict and design around the usurpation of an aesthetic language feels counterproductive to me on a personal level. This is not a judgment. This is not like a claim that I would make as universal, but it would freeze me from trying to do anything if I was always worried about someone taking that image and trying to sell it back, you know, as a kind of problematic thing. And my attitude about it is very much comes out of kind of like looking at the history of queerness over the last like 40, 50 years and what it looks like as a kind of like cyclical rhythm of like things always being like taken back and recapitalized. So in a way, it's kind of like the method is more interesting to me than maybe the aesthetic. And the aesthetic is just a fun thing to play with, knowing full well that it's probably going to end up getting stolen by someone else anyway.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Jaffa, that it's not like very much lies outside of capitalism in the world that we live in. So to put the burden onto the artist or the designer of somehow creating things that cannot be reappropriated is unreasonable. It's just not going to happen. Capitalism is omnivorous. And therefore the goal isn't to keep everything out of the market. The goal probably is to try to, you know, restage certain visions of possibility and potentiality on the one hand, and on the other hand, make use of some of the material conditions of life that actually we're already, you know, caught up in. Like the moment that we're in is a moment in which vast numbers of young people will never be able to own houses, for example, because of the debt to income ratios that they face. The whole future oriented around owning a home must go out of the window. I don't really see how it can't. And therefore, this is a moment to rethink homeowning and to think in terms of other dynamics, transversal dynamics in which people can live together and be in a building together in ways that are sustainable, but don't simply lead to individual accumulation of wealth. And I'm not saying that, oh yeah, so many young people are interested in this. It's a necessity. It's just a necessity. And if you look, for example, in Germany, there are many such ventures, many. There are spaces, I can't remember the name of them, that people buy into the building. You don't pay $700,000 for your little apartment. You pay 30,000 euro to be in the building. And now you all upkeep the building, but you didn't have to come up with this massive amount of money to be there. And if you leave, you get your 30,000 back and you can go be in another building. And then the idea is that we are here to keep this building working, to live together, to create some green space and to be available to each other in certain ways. I mean, these are not, you know, ideas that are completely off the grid. They're actually already happening.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's also in the sort of, I feel like my role in the symposium has been sort of to bring up the temporality of things, or like just be sort of like be timekeeper for stuff in a way. And I'm going to make the same point in a way that I made yesterday, which is part of this, part of that kind of the evolution of your question, Meredith, or the conversation, is like to acknowledge that these kind of like the sincerely mucky is but a moment ultimately, that it's like a very, very temporal kind of situation, that the minute it gets kind of sanctioned as a memorialized park where queer stuff used to happen or whatever, it is already a tipped over into the commodity, and therefore kind of ready to kind of tip over out of the kind of sincerely kind of mucky state, out of the kind of grotesque state that might have represented once or another. So like this, I think a lot of times we kind of lean on history, we lean on this kind of proxy objects, these buildings with cracks, or with, you know, like piers that are perhaps like not completely in a state of ruin, but like in a state of ruination as proxies for like a kind of moment in time that they might encapsulate, but they in themselves might not want to be kind of vitrined in that state. Otherwise, they kind of tip over into a commodity state, into a kind of an acknowledged, borrowable, replicable aesthetic that is either commercialized or touristed or otherwise kind of kept in now in like in an other state that it was in its original celebration of like what was going on there, what was good about that spot. So that kind of cycle of temporal where like the sincerely mucky is just a moment.
Mm-hmm. Are there others?
We have
that
questions in the room. Gina will come around and give you the mic.
Hi. Whoa. Okay. So I guess my question sort of lies in New York City, and I know you guys might be must be really familiar with it. And you know how like there's a section of New York that's becoming fastly like commodified and very like concentrated in capitalism, and then there's a side that's sort of being left behind. So I guess my question sort of lies in like, how do you think post-commodities can either like make that a little bit more equal, sort of making it more accessible to those who don't have as much as those who sort of have too much. And I guess like, how can you like sell this to people to make it more accessible?
You know, I think I'm interested in what Jaffa had to say, because I know Jaffa was going to speak earlier as well. But there are some things that you don't have to sell to people. People are already, you know, outside of, let's say, the lucky 10% or whatever. People want alternatives to this housing market. People don't want to feel that they're constantly on the edge of eviction. I think that we're just in a moment, exactly as you say, where the realities of the difference between the luxury apartment buildings that no one lives in the middle of the city and the apartments that are not being kept up, the rents are being raised and people are being thrown out on the peripheries of the city, that there's never been a kind of starker contrast. I don't think that anyone, you know, outside of that 10% need to be persuaded. The problem is that the 10% sort of decides what goes up and what comes down. And I guess in a way, in response to Meredith, I was trying to question whether with another generation where necessarily the relationships to property are about to change, is there an opening here for people to think differently about how to be in space together and what constitutes living, you know, being in relationship in space? And why have we narrowed it down to the family or the roommate? Surely there are a million, thousands of other ways that people could be in relationship under a roof that you might call home. But all we have are families in waiting, which we call roommates, and then families. And this is the most banal architectural design ever, is the family home, you know. Do better.
Thank you.
I happen to also have a question. We're sitting next to each other. What's your name, by the way?
Oh, I'm Kilala.
Okay. Cool. So I'm Adam. The presentations today, ironically, got me really pumped up, you could say. I feel like my brain is very tumescent right now due to the the presentations. So I just had a couple of questions about nothing. First of all, like, what is nothing? Is there actually such a thing as nothing? Is just curious if Halberson is inspired by Melville's Bartleby, who is really interested in refusal to work. And a related question is, it seems like something we're kind of beating around the bush a bit, or it seems to be in the background of all of these conversations, is like, what is an ethical way of being alive as a human being? And is it ethical to survive under the circumstances of, is it possible to survive in an anti-capitalist way right now, considering how difficult it is to get by if you decide to stop doing things? Yeah, is it ethical to stop doing, and is it possible to survive if we stop doing? That's a lot of questions. Thanks. Thank you very much for the lovely presentations.
Jaffa, did you want to jump in? Because
I'm going to wait for you on this one, Jack, because I mean, I Bartleby's a hero, but you know, I don't know how to build from it.
Well, I know you're going to answer the piece about like, okay, how do we live ethically? You know, how I know you've got that one covered, so I'll leave you with that. Thank you, Adam. Great question from both you and Kalila. Much appreciated. And you know, nothing. I gave a few examples of what nothing could be. It could be the lack of value, depreciation to the point of not having value. That could be nothing. Nothing has been figured as not doing. Nothing has been cast as the female body and castration. And, you know, there's a whole psychoanalytic literature about lack that has figured the space of nothing as a space of dispossession that is captured in a gender hierarchy. But nothing is also a kind of it is kind of the opposite of capitalism in the post-commodities context. Like in a commoditized financial regime, something is everything. Something is everything. So people buy shit and they spend a lot of money on shit, and they just, you know, want to have something. And this is what Paul Preciado calls a kind of pharmacopornographic cycle of excitation and frustration that is developed both through commodity capitalism as well as by the big pharma, and that there are forms of subjectivity now that understand having as basically having in relationship to a market of commodities. So to invest in nothing means that we might be willing to change the template of desire that we currently operate off of, that we think about the uselessness of the stuff that we have taken into our households, and that we also change our understanding of value such that nothing matters. Nothing needs to become part of what people have been talking about today in terms of the materiality of life that is not human, but maybe nothing, but means within a different regime of knowledge. And that's what I mean by knowledge. Bartleby, you know, Bartleby is great. He is the quintessential do nothing, right? I prefer not to. But Veronica Gago's stop doing is way more powerful, in my opinion, because it's interested in a kind of not the singular individual refusal to do something that you're asked to do, but a kind of massive stoppage of the work of reproducing the world that we all do every single day. And when that happens, and the group that Gago is a part of in Argentina has mounted many of these events, these general strikes. They're deeply disruptive, but in order for them to work, they need to be global. And that's what that book is trying to articulate, the Feminist International, or how to change everything. And so it isn't like what we're doing in Argentina, it's how to change everything. So in order to change everything, we could start with nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add to that I think the kind of like The project of withdrawal feels too passive to me. And I really like the gecko example that you just gave, Jack, because it implies there's an energy, like a counterproductive energy, that I'm a lot more excited by than a kind of energy of withdrawal or lack of energy. And I think that I don't know, this is like so beyond my field of work or expertise. I'm just like a, simple architect trying to make my little objects in space. And, I think that like the way of kind of being and working ethically to me has always come back to this idea of kind of like rewriting like codes of value, and where architecture can kind of intervene in art as well, and a lot of kind of creative media work to kind of rewrite how we value things, like across time, across space, across populations, like, in kind of contradistinction to systems of capital and value and desire. And a lot of our work and kind of like, trying to deal with material that exists in the world has to do with trying to give it value somehow, and to like make that somehow work, within a kind of broader context. So yeah, I mean, I think nothingness feels, it feels a little over to me right now, I will say. Like, I think a few years ago, I was like, let's just all like slow down and like take it easy and, self-care and all of this stuff. And this might just be where I am, but it feels a little like the kind of active, counteraction is a lot more exciting and a lot more necessary. And it does require energy to kind of do the work that works to undo, the thing that's made us productive in certain tracks. So I find nothingness a little bit like a little sadder now than maybe I did even like 3 years ago.
I think before, I've actually heard you before explain it as Jeffer, that like extracting new values from that which already exists is one, a very queer thing to do. When you're not granted, we're not kind of like granted the initial kind of access to things, you find secondary access to things and extraction of like secondary values from everything around. One, it's a very queer thing to do, and one, it's a very active thing to do. So it takes a lot of work to do that kind of layered value on things. So which to maybe put it in opposite of nothing, there is a kind of like dynamic nothing, or dynamic like loophole that we're kind of constantly working. There's a question from the internet, if I may. I'm really here just as proxy for the internet. From Leah Wolfman, also in the room. So, thanks for making me your avatar. Leah says, hey, Jack. It just struck me as you were mentioning Gordon Matta Clark as a key example of post-commodities type work, of his lineage back to Duchamp, and of course the ready-made. The ready-made easily defines half of the art world today, and that bleeds into architecture. But as much as using the stuff around us, it's where the art world again buys into consumerism. So wondering mostly if we can also then just more fit Matta Clark into the white punk types, return to the city after white flight and aestheticizing the decay from an outsider's point of view, and seeing the architectures of the city as a ready-made. Does his class and familial background somehow exclude him from the nothingness and the devaluing that he promoted in spaces? There's also a great video from David Hammonds where he invites art friends to a Duchamp rehab center. Side note.
You know what? I'm not that interested in adjudicating whether Gordon Matta Clark in the person was a suitable avatar for this or that political regime. I do know that the intervention that he made was made with not very much money. And he did not sell his work, and he worked as part of a collective at times, and he didn't live very long, to be honest. To be fair, he did work for some 6 or 7 years and then died of cancer at the age of 35. And the only reason that we even speak about Gordon Matta Clark is because his widow held on to all of his stuff, you know, and so there's an enormous photographic archive. But was he trying to, like, you know, set himself up as a kind of central figure within a movement? I mean, I don't think so. And honestly, it doesn't matter to me. I think there are lots of such figures who I might be suspicious of. I feel less suspicious of him. I think some of the performances he did that could be very interestingly read alongside Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World book were about growing fungi in some of these abandoned spaces, and others were about becoming a kind of part of a tree and disappearing into a pod-like space. And he did all kinds of things that are I don't think can be reduced down. The city was his ready-made, and he was a kind of punk appropriator. I can see that he's become a kind of art world darling in a way that is irritating to people. But when I read the opposition between Baltrop and Matta Clark staged by Crimp and others, it bothers me, and it feels like it doesn't understand the dynamic between the two artists working often alongside each other in the piers, both of them hanging from harnesses and both of them making their cuts into the systems that they observed around them. And it's the cuts and the framing of nothing that remains, and that's what I'm working with.
I would just add to that and say I totally agree. And you know, I had that thought about Matta Clark actually during your talk, Jack, a little bit, just like, you know, knowing that he came from a certain amount of privilege. But you know, to me, it's less interesting to dismiss work based on that knowledge and more interesting to actually just find moments of kind of transparency and openness and institutional critique, you know, across the ways that projects come together and supported. And I don't know, it feels like the best we can do now in order to just kind of promote a general kind of creative response to the situation in the world around us and like people kind of trying to do innovative things is just to really constantly hold ourselves accountable to interrogate the institutions that support us, whether those are academic institutions, museums, you know, like systems of finance, grant organizations, et cetera, and to try and perform that critique as best we can, but not to actually dismiss work on the grounds that someone shouldn't be allowed to make it because of who they are. That just increasingly also, maybe I'm turning conservative. That's a problem. I'll work on that. But yeah, it just seems exclusionary and prohibitive and counterproductive. But I also still very strongly feel like we need to figure out where the kind of like money and institutional power is coming from and what it does, you know. And Jack, I don't know enough about the Hammond's piece to know about the kind of like, you were saying something interesting in your talk about how, you know, I don't want to, I'm going to misquote you, so apologies in advance, but something about sort of like tricking the Whitney into paying for this thing, or like a devaluation system. And, you know, I do wonder, like, I feel like the Whitney is like really in control over their budget and purse strings. And like, probably they're like, I wonder if there is a possibility of like having them do anything that would lead to a lack of value, when it just seems like if you actually studied, like their value is always going up. So yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to make that work in terms of like institutional critique projects. But I also then always wonder if the institutions are always like one or two steps ahead, because they all seem to be doing pretty great.
Yeah, there was a long piece in the New York Times of all places. I mean, it wasn't a hidden away piece, but about how David Hammons had been invited by the Whitney to, you know, do something with them as they opened in their new space. And he looked out of the window and he said, "Oh, wow, that's where Gordon Matta Clark's Days End was. I think I'll build a monument to Days End," and then charged them an enormous amount of money for this, and then didn't build it, and then eventually did build it, which was just like this frame. And it's really weird how the piece is positioned, because, I mean, as I said, I ride my bike by it every day, and it's like they're doing some other building there. I can't tell what. So it looks constantly like the whole thing is under construction, and it's right next to this monstrosity called Little Island that was just built. Yeah. And so it has none of the glory that presumably the Whitney had hoped for. It's more like Hammond's snowballs that he sold on the street. You know, it's one of those kinds of projects. And yet I do believe that it's a beautiful and fitting homage to the framing of empty space that was Day's End. There was somebody wrote a really damning critique of it online. I can't remember her last name, Emily something, maybe somebody knows. And I don't agree with the critique at all. I think that was more along the lines of, gentrifying the waterfront sort of thing. I don't think that's what this is. I think this is it's both a conceptual piece and a true, sincere homage to Day's End. There's no monument on the Hudson River Parkway saying this is where Gordon Matta Clark built Day's End. The piers were full of art by Wojnarowicz and Keith Haring and other people, and there's no markers of that legacy anywhere there. The only marker now is David Hammond's beautiful piece, Day's End. And I think it is to me, it's a meaningful project, and it's one that stands in critical opposition, literally, to the Whitney.
Awesome.
Sorry.
Yep. Go ahead.
I'll race you. Jack, I was really blown away by your read on the temporality of pre-grinder cruising and how that had less capitalist fangs in it. And I think your meditation too on seeing these crumbling architectures not just as sites of decay and the end of something, but as spaces where emergent new relations, social relations, returns to old relations and ecosystems of relation can happen. That's, I think, for me, the very generative and that's like away from the disaster porn read of that image, is that what happens when our Wi-Fi collapses, what happens when these buildings fall, yes, the end, but also the beginning or the return of something. So there's something really exciting about that look and that zoom into that, that potent impotency of the moment, like right before the internet invaded everything. So thank you for that read. And Jaffer, I heard you also turning toward the past. I mean, in that, the local past maybe of like grabbing the shreds of recent exhibitions and their small scale demolitions, but also maybe in the way you're thinking through the inheritances of an urban landscape and how you intervene. So I was just wondering if both of you could walk us through a little bit some more, the ways you metabolize the past, when you turn there, how far back are you going? What are you looking for? What's grabbing your eye or your kind of analytical compass? And I guess I'm wondering also, is there a resistance in that turn toward the past? Like it's a turn toward, but it's also a turn away from, or turning your backs on the kind of techno-solutionism, Jack, that you kind of brought up, or maybe even some of the fuzzier poetics of queer futurities and the languages around world building.
I have a sort of easy answer. I'm getting some audio feedback. I don't have an agenda when I look back at the past. I just sort of see whatever's right next to me or like whatever's adjacent. And this is like a thing that comes up in a lot of our projects, that you sort of encounter. We take the found like very, very literally. And like, I try very hard not to fall into kind of like nostalgia traps or like kind of a sense of like longing as a sort of like, I don't know, picturesque experience. But instead try and actually just like see every moment as a kind of like slice through like a time and space in that particular context, and then just kind of play with whatever's there. So it's a short answer, but there's no agenda. There's no kind of sense of like a desire for something. It's more just like, it feels, not in a non-scientific way, it feels like a kind of like lazy analytical method or like a lazy encounter.
Yeah, and I want to note that, I enjoy the way in which, Jaffa, your work goes back, but also the way in which you use apps to try to do something really different, whether it's in relationship to space sharing, or rethinking our relationships to living space. So it isn't, I'm not trying to say, nothing can be done through the technologies that are available to us. And I think Jaffa's work is a really good place to look for some of these alternative uses of those apps. But I am super curious about whether we can stay out of the utopian long enough to recycle some of the projects from the past. We seem to think that we have to invent the future anew every 5 minutes in order to have some sort of optimism. And in fact, I'm learning here from someone like Robin Kelly, who in the book Freedom Dreams reminds us that just because a movement had goals that did not come to pass doesn't mean that there isn't tons of useful material in the political history of that movement. We should be mining all kinds of projects associated with socialism, for example, to see what were the visions of how to live together within a system where profits were distributed and wealth was shared. And I mean, as I said, you can't design your way out of the crisis that we're in, and we can't build our way out of it. And there may be, if we're in the ethos of recycling, there may be tons of material that we've barely tapped into from the past, that within which people were envisioning how to be in space and how to be in relationship to capital and how to be in relationship to each other and to non-human entities in ways that were not just about profit, value and accumulation or extraction. So for me, the past is I'm not a particularly good cultural historian, to be fair and to be perfectly upfront. I haven't tended to do those projects. But somehow this project has just dragged me into the 70s. And now that I'm there, I'm trying to think about why, for example, Jose went back to the 70s, but tried to pull the material from the 70s into a kind of queer futurity of the present. I want to know what the queer futurity looked like from the vantage point of the 70s. Maybe Ray Johnson's Nothings were not trying to reconfigure a homophobic devaluation of the queer, but we're really about trying to undo these investments that heterosexual countercultures were making in happening and something and making. So I'm quite serious about what would happen in queer theory if we really got serious about world unmaking. And I think that some of the answers to that question are in the past, and probably very likely outside of the US.
Do we have time for one more, Laida?
Yep, we can take one more. We'll do it quick.
All right, quick. So I just
Thanks,
have a
Gina.
question. In this post-commodity world, what are ways that we measure success? Because with the Uber capitalism, it's about accumulation, the biggest pile, the most, the growth until we explode, success. But and I bring it up partly because when I talk to students throughout the semester, I'm trying to get them to question how they measure their projects in terms of success. But also, I think the way Laida set up the symposium about like post-stardom art and architecture. There's also this group called Art Co-op that Caroline Woolard is one of the leaders of, and it's sort of asking similar questions about like, why so much for so few when the rest of us are scrambling for crumbs? And so I just find myself a lot lately trying to figure out in terms of whether it's ethics and values, but maybe success isn't even the right word, but what are ways, maybe measure is not even the right word, but if we're talking about quality over quantity, or what do we put forth in terms of quote unquote success?
Isn't it? It's like the kind of car you drive, right?
I'm not that interested in success. I do think it's a good question. Look, it's a good question. How are we going to measure the success of our counter-capitalist movements when success has been completely monopolized by notions of profit? I think that is a really good question, and I think the work that's been presented today at this conference has been interested in how we can produce formally as well as content-wise and aesthetics that takes us somewhere else, that doesn't take us to the same old markers of whether something is good or bad, but it expands upon what a project might be, what it might be for, and what results it might return. And so I think we'd have to return to the question of success at a much later point in order to ask whether any of the work we were doing had arrived, and whether arrival is even the goal.
I mean, it's an interesting, like this is, I hate to end on such like a I don't know, cheesy note, but Jack, Queer Art of Failure was huge for me in this regard, because I remember reading it and having a profound kind of like paradigmatic shift in, the way that, not that I perceived, like, it's not that I ever was after the big car or whatever, but like, just to frame the terms of like failure versus success is inherently kind of like, fungible, interchangeable, manipulable, like the kind of like foundational way that one can make a new set of assumptions about like life itself. So, in answer to that question, I would recommend that book. For me, it's just so personal. And I feel like I've said like for me 1,000 times today, and that's probably another big problem, but what I tell students, at least when I'm teaching, is the success of their project is contingent on the terms around which they've defined their project, right? So like, there's no universal truth. There's no universal way that it's going to be good or bad. But actually it comes down to just like the very definition that they give for their goals in kind of like doing any work. And that can be resistance, it can be nothingness, it can be, like the Bartleby Project, or it can be something that's like radical and action oriented, et cetera. But I think that trying to define like a kind of universal measure of success is the problem, and it's not something I would ever have a good answer for. But I think there are a lot of ways of unknowing success, which in their own terms maybe are successful. And I think that's like a lot more exciting to me. But yeah, I do think it's a good question. It's a very hard one, because the only correct answers are deeply problematic and wrong, probably. So it just has to be kind of like anathema antithetical answer.
Okay, thank you. If there are no concluding thoughts, Meredith, I'm not one for sort of live briefings on 2 days of nuanced content. So I'm going to sort of conclude the symposium by thanking everybody that has participated the last 2 days. Even those that are sort of nothing right now due to sort of failure of Wi-Fi. Very symbolic sort of moment. Is that it might be a success? Maybe that's what made it successful. But yeah, so I want to thank my team. I want to thank Meredith dearly for your introduction. And my team, Ishan Paul, Leah Wolfman, Anna Tang, Ray Majewski, and Gina Laudato, and Delaney McCraney joining us from the other side of the internet, and everybody that showed up to the space. Thank you very much. I will do a bit of like it will come to me what I would have wanted to say in this moment, and I'll email you all.
Can I say one thing, Laida? Which is, I think this is the most successful hybrid event in terms of the way that it all shook out. So I'm incredibly impressed with how you and your team put this together. It actually really worked. It was very confusing at first, but it like really, really worked well.
Thank you. I think we did all this so I could maybe do nothing today. That was the kind of logic. That was the diagram. A lot of stuff at the beginning, nothing today. Thank you very much, everyone. With that, we'll conclude the symposium.